There's only 5 of us on this camping trip. We keep counting 6. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school and were celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them, hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us including me and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration except for, "It's all right, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right?" "I mean there's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty. 1 for me and 1 for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. "Who started the fire?" I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again I scanned the faces staring back at me. All barely illuminated by the light from the fire. All familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. Wait, I don't know, Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. I think we should leave this place, Ava stuttered. Yeah, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it, Dave said. But it's so dark out in the forest now, we'd probably get lost if we leave now, someone else said. Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow, Eric agreed. I tried to protest but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe, Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought one person tents with us, but we could squeeze two if we tried. That way no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally, like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here? Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and... I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it. Since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look over at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it. His head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 5 of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point there were 3 of us running on the trail, Dave and I shoulder to shoulder while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear. As the sounds of a struggle grew behind me, I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. My roommate has been in the shower for more than 4 hours. So I got home at around 11 p.m. Late night at the office turned into an even later night at the bar. About 4 drinks deep at this point and I'm tired, just about ready to fall asleep as I stumble through the doorway. I lay down on the couch and reach for my bag of joints and spark one up as I pull YouTube on my laptop. I'm in the middle of watching some luxury cruise tour, close passing out when I hear the front door open. I sit up and turn my head slightly, just enough to see my roommate coming in. He hangs his jacket in the closet and doesn't say anything and walks slowly to his room, which is normal enough. I'd been living with him for about 3 months, long enough for me to pick up on most of his tendencies. The guy really doesn't talk unless spoken to, which was far from a problem for me. He also generally kept things clean on his end, never causing much in the way of problems. I really couldn't complain. So I go back to watching YouTube and about 5 minutes later I hear the shower in his room turning on. Once again, nothing strange. At this point, I'm watching bare-knuckle boxing highlights with my eyes half open, maybe 1 or 2 minutes away from passing out. I remembering waking up in darkness, my head hurting, my throat dry as hell. I sat up slowly, waiting for the grogginess to settle into something manageable. Once it did, I grabbed my phone, checked the time. Around 3:30 a.m. from what I remember. I was starving and so I got up, began walking towards the fridge. And then I noticed it. A soft, but ever-present noise in the background. It took me a few seconds to really recognize what it was. The shower. Suddenly the events of last night began replaying in my head. Drinking at the bar, Ubering home, laptop, couch. My roommate coming home. The shower turning on. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. Maybe he went to bed and forgot to turn it off? I shook my head. There's no way that happened, I thought. Maybe he slipped and fell? Realizing the implications of this, I rushed towards his room but found his bathroom door locked. I began pounding on it. "Hey man, you alright?" No response. I considered kicking the door down but decided to call 911 before I did that. I took my phone out, preparing to dial when I noticed that I had an unread text. One from my roommate. "Hey man, I couldn't sleep so I went over to my girlfriend's place. Not sure when I'll be back. Sent 2 hours ago." I look at the bathroom door, then back down at my phone. Everything about this was wrong. First of all, my roommate barely texts me, and certainly never to tell me that he's going out. Second of all, I know for a fact that he's single and has been for a while. And third of all, who the fuck was in the shower then? I tried calling him. No answer. Sent him some texts but no response. I walked over to his desk and saw that his keys and wallet were still beside his laptop. My head's starting to spin at this point and I get out of there, go back into the living room and turn on the lights. I'm pacing around in a circle, trying to follow the plot while also trying to ignore the shower, a noise that I never could have imagined being so dreadful in any context. Sometime later, I hear something vibrating on the kitchen counter. I move towards it and see that it's a phone. My roommate's phone. The panic begins setting in and immediately I grab my keys and run out of the apartment. I make my way down the hall and take the stairs down to the lobby, but even that doesn't seem far enough away, and so I make my way over to the McDonald's across the street. I sit there for a while, considering calling the cops but for some reason feeling too nervous to do so. But even though there's hardly anybody in there, the place begins to feel suffocating, and I decide to leave, walking back out onto the empty streets. Almost immediately I get this feeling that I'm being watched, and I feel my gaze drifting up and towards the apartment. Soon I'm looking at my balcony and I see somebody standing there. A dark figure stood completely straight, stiff to the point where it nearly resembles a mannequin, but it isn't one. If I look closely, I can see it just slightly swaying. I froze in place, my mind hardly able to understand or accept what it was seeing. It's not my roommate. It's too tall. In fact, it's too tall to be anybody I know, its head nearly scraping the bottom of the balcony above. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out any of its details. The darkness and distance may have been enough to explain that away. But there was something about it that drove me towards a different conclusion, that this thing simply possessed no details that could have been observed, that the only element of its composition was that of unadulterated darkness. Of course, my gut instinct was to get the hell away from it. But the voice in my head was telling me that if I were to try and run, this thing would end up following me. I went back into the McDonald's instead, locking myself in the bathroom as I finally dialed 911. I told the operator that somebody had broken into my place but that I had gotten out of there without them noticing, but that they were still in there. It was the story that most accurately represented the situation without making me come across as Bat's hit. The operator told me that they'd be sending somebody over for me to hang tight. I left the bathroom, waiting at the table closest to the exit until I could see the red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. I went outside to meet the cops, looking up at the balcony to find it empty, though the door to the living room had been left open. They pelted me with a bunch of questions that I found difficult to answer. Is the intruder armed? Do I have an idea who it might be? What are their intentions? I told them I didn't know, that I couldn't figure it out, but they just kept on asking. Soon I was practically yelling at them to go up there and check it out for themselves, and I suppose the terror in my voice was enough for them to begin taking this seriously. They told me to wait by the entrance, and I watched on as they entered the building. I was out there for a long time, growing increasingly anxious at the thought of what they were going to tell me when they came down. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by a single, muffled gunshot. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I continued to wait there, unsure of what to do otherwise. 20 more minutes of silence, and the officers still hadn't come down. Soon I could hear more of them approaching in the distance. Before I knew it, 4 more cop cars had pulled up around me, and the scene had fallen into chaos. Officers shouting over each other and into their radios, more questions being hurled my way, none of which I was able to answer. The next few sequences were mostly a blur, but I remember the building being evacuated, the tenants frightened and confused as they were ushered outside while the officers became more and more frantic. I remembered hearing more scattered gunshots, some screaming, other noises that were difficult to make sense of. There were a few lapses in my memory after that, but I recall being pushed into the back of a police car. After being driven to the station, I was led into one of the interrogation rooms, where I found 2 nondescript men in suits waiting for me. They didn't introduce themselves and immediately went into a series of questions, each one more bizarre than the last. What company was your roommate employed by? What was the nature of his job? How many different people have been inside your apartment since your roommate moved in? Have you ever heard voices inside the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m.? Voices that did not belong to your roommate. Have you ever seen a circle of people standing outside of the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m.? People that were exceptionally tall? And one of the most unsettling ones, have you ever seen somebody standing at the foot of your bed upon waking up between the hours of midnight to 3 a.m., only for them to disappear moments later? So, do you remember what they looked like? Any distinct features? As they continued probing me, my mind began conjuring up some of the strange shit that had happened after my roommate had moved in, shit that I had written off as figments of my imagination, simply because I had no other explanation for them. I did hear the voices, always coming from the room next to mine where my roommate slept. I was always so tired when I heard them, but I do remember it either sounding like a young woman or a man with an extremely deep voice. I could never make out any words. It always sounded like gibberish. And then there was that one time where I went to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Still half asleep, I didn't bother turning the lights on as I entered. But as my eyes began adjusting to the dark, I could have sworn that somebody was already sitting on the toilet. Somebody extremely tall. Of course, when I turned on the lights, nothing was there. It was easy to chalk it up as a product of late-night drowsiness at the time, and I had never really thought about it since. After doing my best to give them useful information, the suits spent a good few minutes taking notes on their phones. Once they were done, they sat up quickly, told me that they'd be in touch before leaving the room. A cop came in a few minutes later and told me that since I couldn't return to the apartment, they would set me up in a nearby hotel until they were able to get the situation under control, and that I should stay put until they gave me a call. What happened? I asked him. What did you guys find up there? He stared at me for a long time, not as if he were deep in thought but as if he held deep aversion for what he was considering telling me. Eventually he just shook his head. I don't know, he said. I really don't know. I nodded, tried to smile, though I'm sure it didn't come across very well. It's the next day now and I'm in the hotel. Of course I couldn't sleep. Couldn't really eat. The officer hasn't called me yet. When I try searching up information about the evacuation on the internet, all I can find are articles claiming that it was due to a fire. A fucking fire. Update: I fell asleep and I just woke up. It's 1 a.m. now, and I can hear the shower. I thought my boyfriend was the love of my life until I discovered he was drugging me at night. Lately, I've been waking up still exhausted. Even if I went to bed early, I'd wake up feeling like I haven't slept in days. Trying to get out of bed for work was almost impossible, which was strange for me because I was always a high-energy sort of person. A few hours of sleep and I was always good to go. I was at a loss as to what was happening. After a barrage of tests, even my doctor couldn't find anything wrong with me. The only recent change in my life was my boyfriend who had moved in and I was sharing a bed for the first time in my life. Stephen was the first love of my life and this was my first serious relationship. I didn't want to spoil things by making him sleep in the spare room. I liked having Stephen around. He made a real fuss over me and he would bring me chamomile tea every night before bed. The pain in my hip was sharp and pulsated up the right side of my body. Jumped from my bed and nearly collapsed to the floor as I struggled to get to the bathroom. "Stephen, can you get in here?" I cried. A big dark bruise covered my hip, as if I was assaulted in my sleep with a metal bar. "What's wrong?" Stephen said as he came rushing into the bathroom. "Did I fall out of bed or something?" Stephen had a weird expression on his face. I could swear he looked guilty about something. Probably, I don't know. His response was dismissive, which sent my brain spiraling with all sorts of thoughts. "This is not normal, Stephen. I think there's something wrong with me." "You should probably see a doctor then," he coldly said before quickly leaving the bathroom. My doctor was still at a loss and suggested I should see someone who could rule out anything nefarious. Stephen was still dismissive of me as we drove to the hospital. "I'm sure it's nothing. You're probably just stressed from work. People don't wake up with bruises over stress," I angrily thought to myself. The doctor at the hospital took my blood and did all sorts of tests on me, including a stress test. Should have been happy when the test came back clear, but it only made me feel like I was losing my mind. Something was definitely wrong with me. "I would prescribe you sedatives, but your blood work shows you are already on nitrazepam," explained the doctor. I was dumbstruck and wasn't sure what the doctor was talking about. I have never taken so much as a painkiller in my life. The doctor's face looked how I felt. He took out his charts and looked over them again. "No, you definitely tested positive for nitrazepam, which is a powerful sedative." Later that evening, as I sat in bed, a million different thoughts ran through my head. How was that even possible? I thought to myself. As I sat there, Stephen walked in with my chamomile tea, and just as I was about to put it to my lips, I was struck by the most unnerving thought. The realization that my boyfriend was drugging me hit me like a ton of bricks and filled me with a dread I had never felt before. I emptied the contents of the cup down the sink in the bathroom before jumping back into bed. "Was it hot enough for you?" asked Stephen as he jumped into bed beside me. "Perfect as always." I felt as if I was lying beside a complete stranger. Had I ever really known him? I thought to myself as I lay there terrified he was doing unimaginable things to me while I slept. I must have drifted off at some stage because when I woke up the room was a mess and Stephen was nowhere to be seen. My body ached all over and it felt like I was in a fight. What the hell was he doing to me in my sleep? I thought. I had made the decision to go to the police, but I needed evidence, or it was just my word against his. I had purchased a hidden camera and set it up in the bedroom, pointing it towards the bed. I woke up exhausted as usual, which unfortunately meant you had done something to me while I slept, but I had it on camera. I opened my laptop to check the footage. For the first couple of hours of sleep, nothing happened. For a moment I had hoped I was imagining everything until I watched myself jolt from the bed. At first, I couldn't believe what I was doing. It felt like I was watching a horror movie as I watched myself crawl up the bedroom wall like some possessed demon. I continued to crawl up the wall onto the ceiling, looking down over Stephen like I was ready to pounce on him. Stephen woke and it was strange watching him because it was like he was prepared for what was happening and didn't seem fazed by it. He took a stick out from under the bed as I pounced from the ceiling above and he spent the next hour fighting me off. I watched as he subdued me on the bed before pulling out handcuffs and cuffing me to the bed. I looked at the marks on my wrists, which made sense now. As soon as Stephen came home from work, I ran and threw my arms around him. "Why didn't you tell me what you were going through every night?" Stephen shrugged his shoulders. "I thought you knew, and usually the drugs I was giving you made things a little easier. Why are you even still with me?" "My last girlfriend was a jealous psychopath. You're a walk in the park compared to her." "There is a customer none of us are allowed to serve. I work at the Lone Star Diner, off the road from Carson City to Reno. Diner name has of course been changed for obvious reasons. More on that later. Why do I work at the Lone Star Diner, off the road from Carson City to Reno? Well, because, kind stranger, my life plans didn't work out. Generally, if you're caught working at a diner past college, specifically one in the middle of nowhere, it might mean that things aren't going so hot. But still, why this diner? Why Lone Star specifically? I'm aware you probably aren't actually asking these questions, but I nonetheless believe they deserve a response. Of all of the diners in the world, what makes Lone Star so special is the pay. The pay is fucking great. There are maybe 10 other diners within a 30-minute drive from where I live. Most of them average out to a little over minimum wage. Meanwhile, Lone Star is whipping up a mean $50 per hour. And that hourly rate is due to one single solitary reason, no matter what anyone tells you. Because of him. My first day on the job was fine, more or less. I'd worked customer service before, so I felt like I could run with the strange surprises that came unique to diners. I was able to adapt to the inconsistency of the rules pretty quickly. Unwritten rules like, some areas in the restaurant need to be spotless at all times. Others, boss lady couldn't give less of a shit about. Serve customers quickly. But not too quickly, asshole. Customers here don't actually like it when you show up too fast. Give them some time to feel the floor under their boots, to miserably stare ahead, and mourn what could have been. You know, diner stuff. They're here because they want to be alone. Pardon the contradiction. Of course, vaguely defined, whispered only by ghost rules extended to the cooks as well. If you were, somehow, secretly, celebrity chef Marco Pierre White in the flesh, your mandate was to keep your damn prowess to yourself. Your job is to make the classics as decently as possible. Not bad, but not amazing. Just poor enough to be really good. That's what the customers are here for. As the weeks unfolded, I rose, or I suppose, crouched, to the occasion quite well. You want intentional, pinpoint precision mediocrity? You've come to the right person. Most of the patrons just wanted coffee and brunch, brought to them at medium speed, with a semi-predictable cadence of waiter or waitress check-ins afterwards. Done, done, and done. Not one for subtlety. One day I finally decided to ask my boss the question in the middle of a shift. I didn't want to ruin a good thing by doubting it, but fuck me if I wasn't a little curious. Not a full look at the gift horse's mouth, more of a skeptical side eye. Why $50 per hour? She didn't even look up from her task at the register, methodically counting out bills. Said it on your first day, you gotta be good at following the rules. And when it's an important rule, you better be damn well perfect. High expectations here. I made a face. Right. High expectations. You think I'm joking? No ma'am, I guess I just... Why did I even speak up? I just think you're running a really cool operation here. Cooler than you might realize. It's still work, but the whole thing seems... fair? Christ, my waffling skills were abysmal. Add that to the list of intentional mediocrity. Booyah. Looked up from her duties and shot me a stern look. I don't run this ship. And following the rules here means that you take care of yourself. I'm sorry? I am your employer, sure, and I'll pay you well to be here, sure, but you should be aware, there is plenty more going on here than just you in this diner. She glanced down at her watch, then sighed. I usually save this speech for the end of the month, but you already caught me halfway through it. So, the Coles notes. If you don't think you have it in you to follow instructions clearly without protest, and without asking too many questions, then you should leave. Quit. Noir, Nouveau. A week's worth of pay on the house. The conversation sputtered shortly after that. I tried to find an opening to ask more about what she meant, but she was closed off to the topic moving forward. And you know what? That was fine. If she wanted me to put my head down and just do the work, I could do that. And work I did. And things were good. Mundane small talk with the customers was fun. My co-workers were friendly and I was getting paid well. I'd found a place to park the failures of my life. A place to build from. It must have been a Saturday, I think, when I first noticed him. An occupied seat in the far corner of the diner. No idea how long he'd been sitting there and waiting, though he certainly looked patient. I had the strange inkling that he'd been left hanging for quite some time, though I couldn't actually remember seeing him enter. Brown corduroy shirt. Short hair. Mid-50s it seemed. A reasonably calm smile. Normal-looking dude. I started making my way out from the back and headed towards him. Immediately, I felt a tight grip on my arm. It was Melanie, my boss, with a forceful clutch, enough to make me drop my notepad. Her fingers tightened around my forearm, sharply pinching my skin. Important rules, she said. What? You remember our chat about rules? Well, this is the most important one. Okay. Okay? That man over there in the corner. She motioned to the man who had caught my attention. Sitting upright, hands softly clasped together, coy smile across his face. You don't go up to him. You don't say a word to him. But he's a customer? Her hold intensified. She was hurting me. Almost as if she was taking out some sort of unseen anger on me. I'd like to ask you right now to be smart enough to not ask questions and just follow instructions. You don't go to his table, you don't talk to him. You can look at him. You can shout across the room at him if you'd like. Though I can't imagine why you'd ever need to do that. But you do not approach him, and you do not take his order. Or? A sharp exhale through the nose, a shake of the head, and a glare from my manager. It's different every time. But it ain't pretty. I watched him from the short distance I'd been afforded. It was hard not to. She did too. Unlike the other customers here, I didn't get a sense that he was here to be alone, to reminisce, or to take part in the comfort ritual of a lackluster Eggs Benedict over rye. Instead, I had the sense that he was just curious. Mild-mannered, content, but curious. My shift ended not too long after. So I didn't actually get a chance to watch him leave. Regardless, the experience of seeing him and learning about the rule he was connected to left a bizarre, dampening feeling on my mood. I like my job. I like coming home and unwinding. I didn't mind being in the middle of nowhere. It felt nice to look up at the empty sky filled with stars. To see them shimmer and shine and even occasionally shoot across. I made a wish that things in my life would stay simple. I started to get a sense of his cadence. He'd usually show up once a month. The rare times I got to see him, I'd try to squeak in the odd question to my boss. Questions like, who is he, where does he come from, and has anyone spoken with him? All mechanically met with I don't know, and if you're scared, you're welcome to quit. Then, as fate would have it, one day boss lady fell incredibly ill. My coworkers and I had to convince her to go home midway through her shift, her sickness falling, uncomfortably, within the usual 1 to 3 day window at the end of the month when our customer would typically appear. And of course there he was right after she went home. To my benefit, the other waiters and waitresses working the rounds were well aware of his presence and knew exactly what to do whenever he arrived. All of them knew to steer clear of him. Nevertheless, driven by a foundational curiosity that I just couldn't shake, I used this opportunity to go for it. I shouted a single thing across the floor, knowing Melanie wasn't there to chide me. Hello, sir. What brings you here? I asked him. He turned his head from his fixed position in his seat and put a hand to his ear. Clever. I said, what brings you here? I called out again, a few notches louder this time, garnering some odd looks from our Thursday patrons. To my surprise, he spoke back. I'm not sure why I was expecting his voice to carry the tone of some twisted, demented demon. Maybe the fear Melanie had instilled in me? The man sounded exactly how he looked. I'm sorry, dear, he said. I'm afraid I'm not sure what you're saying. Can you come over here and ask me again? No, I was good. And I don't mean to be rude about the service, he continued, but it feels as if no one has taken my order for quite some time now. I let the exchange end there, diverting my attention back to the other guests. As always, he'd eventually disappear without fanfare, without the clatter of the entrance bell or any sight or sound of his steps across the diner floor, our backroom conversations about him remaining dreadfully short while he was there, just, he's here, and he's gone, and the odd when we really needed to say it, I feel really weird about this. It took me a while to understand where my brazenness to address this strange middle-aged man came from. In truth, I was just afraid. His presence and all of the questions tied to his being at our diner were disrupting this otherwise great arrangement that I felt I had. It seemed right, in the moment, to stand at the very edge of my bravery and say something to him. Of course, now that he was gone, I just felt worse. The next week, I was invited to something pretty interesting at work. I generally have a good amount of visibility into what Melanie, boss lady, does on a daily basis. The only element that remained elusive was her bi-weekly check-in with a particularly sharp-dressed agent-looking fella. There was a pretty consistent presence of state troopers, agents, and similarly uniformed men and women dropping into the diner, though I seldom paid it mind beyond simply noticing it. Midway through wiping down the tables, only an hour or so into my shift, Mel swung by and said, "Hey, want you in the meeting with the big boss if you have a few." The big boss? Sure. Yeah, coming. Just, if you don't mind me asking, who is? She let her eyes speak her unwritten rules to me. Questions equals generally bad. Thank you for the reminder, ma'am. We maneuvered to a back room and sat at a table. Across from us, already seated, was a man in a sharply tailored suit with a subtle earpiece in the aforementioned agent. The table was littered with a small, messy stack of notes, papers, and documents. He made it a point to size me up, staring me down uninterrupted like a deer to headlights, no concern at all about how awkward. He was making it for me. Then he turned to Melanie. "How long's she been here?" he asked her in his gruff Western drawl. 6 months, she said. "I trust her?" "I trust her. Yes." He let his eyebrows say, "If you say so," then went on with it. "All right, so, apparently Y had a visit from the wandering man last week. You," he said, motioning to Melanie, "were out. But you," attention now shifted to me, "weren't. Give me the lowdown." "The wandering man?" The agent caught the confusion in my eyes. "Jesus, you've told this girl nothing, haven't you?" he said to Melanie. "Sir, I know it sounds weird," she said, "but I personally feel as if the man is almost, I don't know, drawn to curiosity. Like, maybe the less I say to those not already in the know, the bet." "Wandering man," the agent cut her off, "is our nickname for the fella that sits in the corner of your fine little establishment. Or should I say, the state's fine little establishment." "I'm sorry?" I asked. "That's correct. The state's. Congratulations, ma'am, you're part of a government operation. The wandering man, not just a cutesy little nickname, but our legal definition of this tricky little problem is a phenomenon we discovered many years ago. At the time, he just walked the desert landscape, chatting up unsuspecting strangers with bizarre questions. Everything fine, all hunky-dory. A little weird, sure, but nothing illegal. However, sometimes, things would happen because of him. Bizarre things. Grisly things." I could see Melanie groaning, concerned at the picture being painted. Would this pique my curiosity? "Have you guys, taken him in for—" I almost wanted to cut off my own stupid question, but he ran with it. "Nope. Not because we don't want to, but rather because it might not be safe." The cozy mental image I'd held of this diner was starting to fracture. "We have reason to believe that he's a visitor," he said. "From?" I didn't attend another debrief after that. Not because I was barred, mind you. Rather, I just didn't want to know anymore. My gut no longer held curiosity. There was just a low, aching dread there now. The agents and troopers, spaced out and seated amongst the eatery, were now just a glaring reminder of what my dingy diner job really was. The government cavalry would mostly show up around the end-of-month window the wandering man was set to arrive in. When he'd appear, they wouldn't do much more than examine him from their distant tables, subtly scribbling notes into notebooks. He'd always act the same. He would just sit there. He wouldn't give them, or us, the diner employees, much to go on. Speaking of employees, I remembered something Melanie told me after my first month of working here, that the worker turnover at this diner was incredibly high. Knowing at the time what everyone got paid, it made absolutely no sense to me. Now, 7 months into the gig, alongside a completely new set of cooks, waiters, and waitresses from when I'd first started, I'd seen firsthand just how true her statement was. None of the leavers claimed as much, but I'm sure the underlying premise of who the diner was really for became subconsciously clear to them during their time here. And it probably didn't sit all too well with them. I stayed, but not because of the pay. I'm actually not sure why I did. We had a new cast of rookie employees now. The ones who understood the vague terms of the situation just as Melanie, I, and all former employees did stuck around. Those who couldn't reconcile the situation with their inherent curiosity naturally filtered out. And then there was Malcolm. It was only his first week. He was a keener. Mekakener. He'd bulldozed through a giant list of tasks and was already asking for the next batch of work to chew through. Anything he could get ahead of, anything he could step in for, anything he could learn, he was on it. He wanted to be as helpful as humanly possible. I think the salary of the role for a guy his young age was just too alluring for him. For our part, Melanie and I tried our best to get him to pace himself. We were both giving the spiel now. By this point, we'd more or less perfected it. There are things about this diner that are strange. Rules you will have to follow and not think about. Rules that are concrete, immutable, and non-negotiable, like gravity. He nodded. At that moment, I really believed he was internalizing my words. And if that doesn't work for you, and if you don't think you can take care of yourself, then you shouldn't work here, I continued. There was always a visceral feeling in my stomach whenever I saw the wandering man in the corner during the same week that we were onboarding new staff. I'm sure Melanie felt it too. On those days, Mel and I would both work the till, and if we saw anyone coming out from the back, we'd stop them with a simple grab of the arm. Malcolm stepped out, and I did just that. A rough grasp of his forearm, just like Melanie had done to me when I'd first started. He recoiled in surprise. "Remember that little chat about rules we just had?" I said. He nodded meekly as if he was already in trouble. I pointed to the man seated at the far table in the brown corduroy shirt, staring straight ahead, with what I believed at the time no real reason to be here, and I said, "You will not, under any conditions, serve that man. Don't go up to him, don't talk to him. Pretend he doesn't exist." Malcolm lifted the garbage bag he was holding in his left hand. In my nervousness, I hadn't actually clocked what he was stepping out for. "Just doing garbage duty, ma'am," he said. "But, understood." And then he left out the front door with his usual swagger. The dumpster wasn't as close as we would have liked, so I appreciated his willingness to take on this duty so soon into his employment. I turned back to observe the wandering man. We had a crowd of agents in attendance that day, scattered about the restaurant. The man wasn't one to speak up often. Today was an interesting exception. "Officers," he said, "if you have any questions, feel free to join me at the table to ask them." The agents around the room reacted mainly with snickers. "Seriously, if you come sit with me, I'll be happy to spill it all." "Truly." Even more laughs. But no one bit. And yet he continued pointedly. "I know you're curious, I know you take notes, I know you talk about me, I know you built this establishment for me, I know you..." As I reconciled the fact that this was the most words I'd ever heard him string together in succession, I heard the chime of the bell. A door had opened. Malcolm was dusting his hands as he entered. Through the diner's side door. A door which was situated right beside the table the wandering man was seated at. It all happened so fast. And yet, it played out in front of me excruciatingly slowly, as if there was a moment, a single solitary second, where I could have stepped in. The wandering man dropped any pretext of an exchange with the agents, stopping his sentence midway and adopting a completely new demeanor. He played the role of a low, miserable, tired man and said, 30 visits, terrible service every time," in a pathetic tone just as Malcolm walked by. Malcolm, instinctively, plucked a notepad out from his chest pocket and turned his head to face the man. "Hey, I got you, Chief, I can have him ring something up for you, what are you?" And then Malcolm froze in place. And the wandering man's expression turned Cheshire cat wide. His neck alternated between tensing and fluttering, with what seemed to be undeniable excitement. The man started getting up from the table and then, immediately, both of them were gone. Malcolm and the wanderer had vanished out of existence entirely. The insanity of the moment was interrupted by the coded language I heard blared over a megaphone, nonsensical agent speak that has been seared into my memory forever. Alert level black. Wandering target has compromised a civilian. I repeat, civilian has been compromised. And that was that. Melanie quit in the days after. She wasn't mad at me. She told me she always knew she'd leave after the 10th disappearance. Why that specific milestone was required, I have no clue. All I could do from that point was continue to work. On my commutes home or during lunch breaks, I would look up at the stars and put out the wish that Malcolm be brought back home. Back from wherever he'd been taken. The debrief with the agents brought me no solace. The exchange with them was simple and short. "Where was he taken to?" answered with, "He's gone now." With a perpetual dagger in my soul now, I had only the smallest of silver linings, if you can even call it that. A lesson. The lesson that I needed to be even more watchful. Even more diligent. And on days when the wandering man was visiting, the only server at the diner. No exceptions. I knew the agents weren't happy about that. None of them said it to me explicitly, but I could tell that they would learn something new about him every time he whisked someone away after a mistake was made. It was a weird, Darwinian setup they had created. We were a zoo they could use to learn more about a specific animal, a specific entity, a specific visitor. No dice. They just have to watch him sit now. Or wait for him to do something different. I waited for the 3-day stretch at the end of the month that he usually appears in. Things were quiet up until that point. When he finally showed up, it wasn't what I expected. For the first time ever, I saw the wandering man walk right through the front door. In the dead of night, at the tail end of my shift. I was at the till, paralyzed as he took step after step to close the distance. And then he was right there, standing in front of me. And I was sure, absolutely sure, that I was going to die. He smiled. "Don't worry. I have my own little set of rules I play by," he said. I didn't say a word. This was no man's land right now. "I know you've been curious about me. I've admired it from the moment you first spoke up to address me. Cautious curiosity is a great thing to see in someone, especially in such a reckless species. Please just go. I'd like to answer a question about why I'm visiting." I'm sure you'd like to know why I'm here, right? I'm not curious anymore. I swear I'm not. He laughed. The answer is really painfully simple. This little game, this little charade I'm playing. It is just so unbelievably fun. Please don't kill me. Please. You truly have a wonderful planet. I will return again soon. Promise. Give me a month, maybe two this time. A sincere, kind smile delivered with kind eyes. I'll come back with a new game. And then he was gone. It took me a minute to realize that there was a cake box sitting on the counter beside me. Maybe it was there the whole time he was speaking to me. Maybe it materialized right after he left. I opened the box to find Malcolm's severed head, a blank expression on his face, sitting on a bed of poorly and confusingly organized flowers. Almost as if there was an intention to create a floral arrangement, but no understanding of what something like that would look like. On top of the horrific display, written in an almost childlike handwriting, was a note that read, "I brought him back, just like you wished." The worst thing about being trapped at a diner in the middle of nowhere is that you realize that there really is nowhere else to run to. Every single part of our planet is blanketed by stars, by open sky. Someone could drop in any time. The only other astronaut on this mission died 6 weeks ago, but the computer insists their life signs are still stable. When Ben died, he made very little noise. It was the computers that alerted me. Shrill alarms and flashing lights. I hadn't even gotten out of my sleeping bag before my smartwatch had lit up with half a dozen messages about system failures. Astronaut 1 heart rate monitor failure, Astronaut 1 skin conductance monitor failure, Astronaut 1 VO2 monitor failure. The situation didn't sink in until I was shaking an unresponsive Ben. White eyes rolling back into his skull. Blood pooling in his ears like red jelly. Viscosity. Massachusetts. No gravity. It made me nauseous to look at. HQ would later say Ben died from an aneurysm. 1 in a million. A freak death that just happened to occur in low Earth orbit. So what now? I asked after all the panic had died down and the reality of my situation finally settled in. HQ sent me a rarely used or discussed document that outlined what I'd have to do. Bodies pose a unique threat in microgravity, it explained. All that order becomes disordered. What is solid turns to liquid. What is liquid turns to gas. First thing I needed to do was to put Ben's body somewhere that had no oxygen and was freezing cold. Somewhere he would pose no danger to himself or me. Isolated but easily retrievable. The conclusion was obvious. I knew what they'd suggest before I even reached that part of the booklet. It happened so fast that Ben was still warm when I put him in the special bag designed to endure the vacuum of space. I kept expecting him to protest as I pulled at stiffening limbs and manipulated swelling joints. Every step of the process. Every zip. Every bit of Velcro. I had to remind myself he wasn't going to complain. It felt intimate, but it wasn't. Intimacy requires 2 people. By that point, Ben was just meat. The spacewalk itself was something else. The bag that surrounded Ben's body inflated in the vacuum, and I instinctively felt the urge to undo what I'd done. There was a body in there, and bodies aren't meant to have so little between them and outer space. When I touched the bag, I could still feel him beneath the paper-thin material. The crease of an elbow. The bump of his nose. By the time I reached my destination, his body already felt brittle. Attaching him to the station was easy enough on a technical level. Leaving him there went against every instinct I had. After that, there was no pretending he was coming back. A day later, and I began to pack his things away. There was a catharsis in it that I found calming. I cataloged his belongings with thin detachment. Most of his things were dry and uninteresting. Photos of him with a dog. A copy of a Michael Shea book. A certificate of excellence from NASA that he received when he was 10. He discovered a comet, he told me during our first meeting. Backyard with a telescope. NASA let him name it and everything. That was how he knew he wanted to be an astronaut. Described it as a calling. Ben was like that. A real-life Boy Scout. In life he'd had no edges. You'd think given our history we'd be close. 2 men selected based on extensive psychological profiling. Together we had simulated multiple missions to Mars. 2 on the ground. 1 in space. All of them highly secretive. An official mission to Mars was meant to be next, at which point the whole project would be made public. But the key to having 2 people work together, alone, for nearly an entire year isn't to find 2 guys who are best friends forever. It's finding people who won't grate on one another. Neither hate nor love. 2 men who enjoy their own company but don't mind one another. Ben and I had become acquainted over all that time together, but it wasn't like we were brothers in arms. We worked so well precisely because there was no meat to the friendship. No stakes. Nothing to argue over. To me, Ben was a nice guy, but that was all. I figured he was plain and simple all the way down. No dark secrets. No real problems to speak of. The journal changed that. It was taped to the inside of a panel of a computer at his workstation. He must have hidden it close to his things, somewhere out of sight but easily retrievable. Frayed leaves and yellowed pages, like some ancient artifact. Last thing I expected to find in a space station. I almost mistook its leather cover for some sort of personal Bible, the sort of well-worn tome held up by a preacher making exclamations about the devil, but its insides were handwritten, and hardly in keeping with a Bible. Scribbles, shapes, phrases repeated and dissected. Some of it was even in binary. It seemed like the ravings of a child or a lunatic. I thought it was maybe a mindfulness exercise. Empty-headed doodling to help him get his head straight during stressful moments. But that didn't explain why he'd hidden it, and why the numbers and pages seemed strangely organized. I don't know how to describe it exactly, except to say there was the vague impression that it meant something to the person who'd made it. Every last gram on a shuttle is accounted for. What you bring up with you, it can't be some random crap you want last minute. Ben would have had to clear the journal. I'm assuming he kept the contents secret. One look at what he'd been writing and NASA would have had him in psych eval before the end of the day. But the book's size and weight would have had to be logged and accounted for. It could not have gotten on the station by accident, so I knew immediately that Ben had wanted it for something. I studied it for over an hour trying to figure out what that was. Flicking from one page to the next, glaring at rows of numbers, strange fractals, something that looked like a cross between an eye and a textbook drawing of an atom. Given the way his writing and art skills developed throughout the book, I began to suspect he'd been adding to it since his childhood, which was just another layer to the growing mystery. I thought I was never going to get any insight into the book until, about 3/4 of the way through, I came across yet another page filled with rows and rows of numbers. Only this time one of the strings was underlined and a single word had been scratched ragged and angry next to it. The only bit of English or any human language in all those pages. The only thing written in a way that could make sense to a living human. The word itself made me stop dead in my tracks. Made my blood run cold. 1703180426336 aneurysm. The suspicion that came over me felt like a kind of madness. I told myself I had to be nuts when I checked the data from Ben's biomonitor, that I had to be crazy to even entertain the notion, but the information recorded by several different machines confirmed it. Ben's exact time of death was the March 17, 2018 0426 hours and 36 seconds. I don't think I moved for a good 15 minutes after that. Just stared at the data as my mind worked its way around a giant, impossible realization. Ben knew he was going to die. Of course I tried to rationalize this. Anyone would. I came up with half a dozen reasons he'd written what he'd written. None of them were comforting, although they at least fit in with a more rational worldview. Take, for example, the idea that Ben had killed himself at that exact moment in time to meet some sort of prophecy he'd scrawled days or even hours before. Was that a good thing? What did it mean for me? Ignore the logistical issues, what poison can be timed to the second? Let's just say that's what he did. That left the hair-raising question of why? And there was no comfortable answer that I could see. Of course I went through that book with a fine-tooth comb looking for any more clues. I wish I hadn't. I eventually found another word, this one closer to the very end of the journal. Another date and timestamp, one that lay 6 weeks in the future, and another word scratched painfully into the paper by a clumsy fist. Immolation. Permission denied. I bit my lip and took a deep breath. What about the station's integrity? I asked. No sign of any issue from external cameras, they replied. I can hear something banging on the hull, I told them. Nothing is visible on the cameras. That's why I need to go take a look, I wrote. It's hard to argue with a computer. You can't shoot at a death glare. HQ could have easily arranged video calls. But really they wanted the distance. Made it easier to say no. Solo spacewalk is incredibly dangerous, they quickly wrote back. Microphones and station hull are reporting nothing of concern. Usual impact from debris. Nothing that corroborates reports of external tapping. Permission for spacewalk is denied. I made no further response but instead closed the screen and wondered if they were being entirely truthful. The tapping sound, coming and going over the last few days, was unmistakable even over all those whirring machines and motors. Space stations are loud. They even give us earplugs to handle it. But whatever was out there was somehow louder. Or perhaps, given the circumstances, I was just sensitive to the thought of something, anything, out there. There was no denying it annoyed me. Just one of those sounds I found impossible to block out, like water dripping in a bathtub at 3 a.m. Tap tap. Tap tap tap. Tap tap tap. Tap. No sense of order, not on the surface level, but something, maybe, underneath. Some sense or reason. Some kind of regularity that the brain detects and can't let go of. How could the microphones possibly miss it? Sleep was getting progressively difficult. At times I thought the station under some kind of hidden stress. Materials freezing and warming in irregular ways. No atmosphere, no conduction of heat. Things get hot in the sun's rays. Objects warm and cool to both extremes. This is routine stuff for anything. Up in space, of course. But it didn't stop me thinking about all the ways the station was just a pile of metal that could come undone. Could break and tear. Bend and stretch. Like watching the wing of your plane wobble during turbulence, it's an uncomfortable reminder that you're just a monkey in a fancy toy. And what if something had come loose? Something. Wow. At first I stuck to this notion strictly, asking myself what if some antenna or strap or bit of metal had gotten loose and was banging against the hull. That would be bad. But of course that wasn't really what I was thinking. It's what I wrote to HQ about. Over and over and over. But what was really on my mind was the thought that maybe, somehow, he had gotten loose. And of course that's not so silly, right? The specially designed bag he was in, the one that would vent any gases produced by decomposition while maintaining his body's integrity, was brand spanking new. Know how many times it had been tested? Never. Never ever. Ben was the first. So of course it might come loose. Just because it's space-age technology. Doesn't mean it's sophisticated. He was strapped to the outside like a Christmas tree to the family sedan. Maybe, I wondered, one of the straps had broken and now he was thumping against the side every now and again. Never mind that there wasn't anything out there to prompt that kind of buffeting. No air. No wind. If he'd come loose he'd just float a little farther away. But something was making that noise and I worried almost constantly that it was him. Only problem was I had cameras. Lots. And all of them every single time showed the same thing. The bag barely changed from when I last saw it in person, strapped firmly and securely to the station's hull. This should have reassured me. Should have, but it didn't. Something was out there tapping at the hull. On and off. No pattern. No reason. No correlation. It came and it went, seemingly choosing its moments to bother me the most. Sleep was difficult for multiple reasons. The tapping was bad enough, but lately my nightmares had taken a strange turn. Black. Cold. In them I was trapped in a suffocating film. Freezing cold. Non-stop agony, fighting furiously to free myself was this black void of a nightmare. Like all deeply terrible dreams, it colored my thoughts for the rest of the day, and each time I had it, it got harder to shake. I tried to endure. Compartmentalize. Take my mental turmoil and put it in a box, right unhinged across the lid, and sit rocking back and forth waiting for my rescue. And that was an option. A good one. But there was one little word that stopped me going the route of hunkering down and ignoring my own madness. Immolation. When HQ told me the date of the shuttle would reach me, I spent quite a bit of time wondering if this wasn't just some big experiment. The sheer coincidence of it all. The magnitude of it. They'd sent me the message and the subject line had 3 exclamation points, like the communications officer on the other side couldn't wait to deliver good news for once. Let their professionalism slip. They'd finally arranged a shuttle to retrieve me after it was done dropping some guys off at the ISS. It was lucky it had come so soon. A stroke of logistical genius allowed them to sneak Ben and me back without it being too conspicuous. I should be very thankful, they told me. But I was just stunned. The date matched the one Ben had written out. Factoring in travel time, I'd be entering Earth's atmosphere at the exact time the prophesied moment would come and go. Ripe for an error, a misplaced heat pad, a mistimed thruster. Something, anything to go wrong and leave me plunging to my death in a burning metal tube. Ripe for immolation. If it wasn't Ben out there tapping away, I wanted to know. I needed to know. I was a rational man. A skeptic. I did not believe the natural world would produce a man that could predict his death down to the minute or the second. Nor did I believe he could predict mine. But I am only an animal. I am made of meat. Vulnerable. A raw nerve in a world of jagged rocks. And I am risk-averse. That word. Immolation. Not random. Not chance. Up in the void surrounded by pure oxygen, fire was a constant risk. Ben's little numbers loomed large in my mind. I had to make sure everything was in place. I had to make sure there were no errors. If it was a prediction which I refused to accept at face value, then maybe I could take heart from it. What could Ben do in the face of an aneurysm? Nothing. But immolation. Fire. An accident. That sort of thing could be avoided. Just so long as everything was in working order. Just so long as everything was where it was meant to be. What did HQ know? Cameras and remote operators. Not enough. No one else was in that tin can except me. Why even have humans in space if you wouldn't trust their instincts and judgments? I needed to know what was making that noise. I needed to get out there. HQ caught on too late. I was inside the suit, the airlock cycling by the time they realized. I chose my timing well. Halfway through my maintenance shift. Told them I was taking a look at the suit, make sure everything was in order. Meant they were slow to catch on to what I was doing. Technically they could stop the process at any stage. They could do anything from their side. But I threatened to force a manual override that would shut them out from that part of the system. They told me they'd court-martial on return, but that was a piss-weak threat. For me, the stakes were higher than a court-martial. In the end, they backed down. Know how hard it is to build a space station in secret? It came first. If the spacewalk went wrong and I died, the station would still be there. $1 billion asset awaiting the next top-secret mission. It was my neck on the line, not theirs. I accepted it. Under time pressure, HQ accepted it too. By the time the door finally opened and I was able to gently guide myself out and around the rim so that I was clinging onto the station's exterior, they'd already tapped into the cameras and were guiding me along to my destination. But it was background noise to me at that point. Their voices and little pings. Constant readouts of suit temperatures and the distance to the station hull. Meaningless. All of it. What mattered was the sound. Tap, tap, tap. I was anxious by this point. Or perhaps, if I'm honest, scared. Space is all extremes. Not just heat but light too. The shadows cast are vast and strange. You move in and out of the Earth's shadow like it's a hand in front of a projector. And the ones cast by yourself and your surroundings are a special kind of black. The station, with its myriad of pipes and cables, was covered in abyssal shadows. Long warped things with ambiguous origins. Sometimes I looked at the darkness and wondered if there was anything there at all, or if the station was simply bisected by some kind of strange cosmic force. Like I might fall into it somehow. Forever lost. Normally I'd think it was beautiful. Spacewalks had for me in the past been an almost religious experience. This carried the same sense of weight but for very different reasons. I felt watched. Something I tried to ignore, but it got harder and harder. Kept looking over my shoulder. Kept overthinking every little bump and vibration I felt on the station's hull. By the time I reached the place where I had strapped Ben's body, I was close to a panic attack. That whole part of the station was covered in darkness. The kind where I couldn't see a damn thing. It was only HQ's voice telling me I'd reached my destination that let me know Ben was lying just a few feet from me. Under their direction I found him, and when my light fell upon the bag itself I saw the metallic fabric glitter with ice. Touching it, I felt Ben's frozen body inside. Hard as rock. I gave him a nudge and he didn't move an inch. The straps holding him in place were still there, firm as ever. What else could be causing the sound? I asked. There is one option. The nameless voice on the other end sounded reticent, but that had been the default since Ben died. HQ always sounded like they were holding something back. What's that? We are not 100% certain how corpses would respond to the changing temperatures and vacuum. Obviously, parts of the body will freeze and expand. Fluids in particular. Right now the bag has a lot of surface contact with the metallic hull. One theory is that blood may be freezing and sublimating as the surface beneath changes temperature. I looked at the bag and grimaced. How much blood exactly? We cannot possibly say for certain how much would have left the body. Only that the bag's job is to contain it until return. We are able to confirm using instruments in the station that the panel you are standing on is well below freezing. Everything should be in a manageable state, so to speak. Solid, likely one large clump. They replied, and then after a moment they added, you wanted this. It would be a waste of resources now that you're out here not to investigate further. You need to look inside. Of course I'd wanted this, hadn't I? To satisfy my morbid curiosity? To address the rabid thoughts in my mind that had kept me awake, filling what little sleep I had with nightmares. Now that I was at the threshold, I found myself so afraid that even moving my hand took a kind of effort. And yet I had no choice. I had to see this through. The bag opened with a specially designed zipper. No sound, but I could feel the click 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 of the specialized teeth opening up. It's stupid, but as I unfurled the flap I could have sworn a terrible foetid stench passed over me. It lasted no more than a few seconds, but was so vivid I turned and snapped my eyes shut as they watered. Power of suggestion, I told myself as I reopened them. That was all. Nothing more. No air. No sound. No smell. I took a few deep breaths, tried not to let the incident unsettle me further, and looked inside the bag. Multiple people watching my video feed gasped while I made a fairly unflattering noise somewhere between a moan and a cry. I'd expected something. God, at worst I'd expected something ghoulish. Blue skin. Icicles collecting around the eyelashes. Like a body found in the Arctic. But Ben had transformed. Great jagged shards of frozen blood had erupted from the eyes and ears and mouth. His jaw dislocated to an unnatural angle as an icicle the size of my forearm forced its way out. His neck was broken, his torso shredded with strips of flesh hanging off in ribbons, and his hands were clawing at his face with bizarre yellow nails. They'd even left grooves in his skin. What the fuck is this? I asked no one in particular, only to realize that HQ had been talking amongst themselves. The whole time. A malfunction in the bag, unexpected pressure, temperature changes. No, this isn't normal. Let's not pretend this is normal. Guys. I shouted, splitting the chatter and leaving silence. Why are his arms like that? Muscle spasms possibly caused by, well, whatever caused the unusual reaction in his circulatory system. Maybe that caused his arms to curl up towards his face. There are scratch marks on his cheeks, I replied. Skin under his nails. Are we sure he was dead when I brought him out here? A dozen urgent, alarmed voices, all desperate to avoid even the slightest hint of responsibility, told me no, that was not possible. But looking down at Ben's tortured face, I couldn't help but feel a bit of doubt. I was about to ask what I ought to do next when the sun rose across the station. Unlike Earth, this wasn't a gentle morning. It flipped like a light switch. Thankfully the suit reacted before it had a chance to blind me, but the temperature began to rapidly climb. I watched as something beneath Ben's skin began to writhe in the new warmth. That's definitely not normal. We can offer no further insight into the situation as of this moment. The footage you're sending us is under review by a panel of experts, HQ told me somewhat urgently and robotically, like the person on the other end was stifling panic. Current orders are to take samples, reseal the bag, and return to the station. You sure I should be taking this stuff inside? There was some mumbling before the same operator replied. Forget samples. Seal the bag. Return to the station. Gladly, I replied before pulling the zipper shut. I was keen to leave and made the journey back faster than I should have. That crawling sensation you feel when being watched, it was all over me. Made me clumsy and I knocked myself more than once on the way back, like I was suddenly unused to the suit's controls. I just couldn't escape the notion that everywhere I looked someone or something had darted back just out of view. Of course that was impossible, so I told myself, what could survive out in space? But it only made it that much worse to imagine something slinking into the shadows, tapping on the hull, stalking me every step of the way back. When I finally reached the door, the tension inside me rose. If something was going to happen, it would happen now with my back turned on infinity. I had never felt so vulnerable. Reynolds. The sound made me jump. I'd been so focused on my surroundings I'd forgotten I was being supervised by a room full of people 1,000 of miles away. What is it? Reynolds, we're seeing something here we're not sure of. Being told you should hold off on returning. Something about the voice on the other end made my stomach sink. They didn't just sound confused, and make no mistake, when you're clinging to the side of a station all on your own, confused would have been bad enough. But no, there was something else. Fear. There's an anomaly, they added. No one down here knows how to proceed. We're currently seeking input from higher ups. This is unprecedented. What's going on? It began with, signals from some of the biomonitors. Specifically Ben's. That last word hit like a truck. What? Yes. And the cameras are. At first we thought they were malfunctioning. It appeared as if Ben's bag was empty. And then, Reynolds, we noticed something. Something else. Guys, what's going on here? I'm being told I can't say more. Just wait. I tightened my grip on the railing, my heart pounding. Finally the door cycled open and I was ready to disregard all orders when the man speaking to me from HQ practically screamed in my ear. Don't enter. Reynolds, do not enter the station. What we're seeing on the cameras, you can't let that in. If something's out here, I'm getting to safety before it reaches me. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped. My brain processed. I'd heard that. I'd heard something in the vacuum of space. I looked around at my hands, my feet. That couldn't be possible. Not unless. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap. Without moving my head, I turned my eyes towards the very edge of my helmet's vision and watched as a single yellow fingernail tapped gently on the glass. The man in HQ spoke in a terrifying whisper. He's on your suit. The terror that shot through me was electric. White fire coursing through my veins. Without even thinking, I reacted like I just found out there was a grenade strapped to my back. All instinct. No rationality. I cried out and swung around, trying to knock Ben off my back, but all I accomplished was setting off some alarms as I damaged my suit. Get it off. I screamed at no one in particular. Get it off me. I thrashed desperately and felt something shuffling around the exterior of the bulky suit. Finally, my eyes fell on something useful. The jet controls. I fumbled my hands into place and immediately blasted myself into the open pressure chamber, turning at the last minute so that the back of the suit smashed into the thick secondary door. I only hoped that whatever was clinging to the back of me was destroyed by the impact, but when I looked up, Ben was still out there gawping at me with a mouth full of frozen blood. Slowly, his movement packed with the eerie confidence of a predator, he prepared to enter the station. Reynolds, get away from the door. We're initiating an emergency shutdown. Ben had one hand inside when the door slammed shut and cut it off. Even in space with the bulkhead between us, I could have sworn I heard him scream. There was no ignoring Ben or the sounds he made. Not anymore. Terrible thumps that battered the station, their location changing seemingly at random. This drove the people on the ground insane. Oh, I'd heard my fair share of rationalization over the last few hours. Been sent books worth of written material from every type of expert you could imagine. Ever since my colleague's death, I'd been wrestling with all sorts of bizarre thoughts, but after the spacewalk it was like they'd spilled out of my head and were now terrorizing other like-minded skeptics. Try as they might, no one in HQ could make sense of it. But they didn't have the journal. After what happened during my spacewalk, it became a priority for me to figure out what the fuck was going on. Those numbers Ben had recorded weren't gibberish. I'd sort of known that from the start. To read them was to feel like you were reading another language. Something secret and hidden. And while I never cracked the code, not even now after all this time, I did figure out where Ben had found it. What? The trick was to dig deeper into Ben's research. Specifically a pet project of his he'd spent nearly his entire life chasing. A little comet, a ball of ice, way out in the Kepler belt close to where the solar system abates and the great cosmic void begins. Something small and insignificant that rotated and shifted and occasionally caught the sun, bouncing photons right back at us. A glittering snowball so faint as to be invisible unless you happen to look at the right place at the right time. Like Ben did when he was just 10 and playing with hobbyist Dad's backyard telescope. A light in the darkness. A light that spoke to a few instruments Ben had adjusted to record each little emission. Flash on. Flash off. Flash on. Flash off. Flash on. Binary to hexadecimal, and from there, got something else. Something that spoke to him. Something out there had spoken to him. I don't know what scared me more. The sound of a reanimated Ben pounding away at the station, an imminent all-too-near threat. Or the thought of something in the void whispering unknown secrets to a man for the last 2 decades. An idea that occasionally rose over me like the tide swallowing me whole if I dwelt on it for more than a few moments. I never did figure out what the transmission was saying, but I was transfixed nonetheless. Not just by Ben's little journal that contained hundreds, thousands of handwritten records, but the live transmission he had set up on his computer, the one he'd converted into a sound. It was like an earworm on steroids. Like white noise made of acid, a flood of alien ideas that left me confused and drooling if I listened for too long. All told, I spent no more than a few days with access to that transmission, and by the end I felt like I was on the verge of melting away. But Ben had been exposed to that thing since his childhood. Spent years and years listening and recording and waiting, working towards something none of us could really hope to understand. I had to assume that transmission was responsible for his death, and even worse, what had happened to him afterwards. Had it always been the reason for his coming to space? Had the Ben I'd known just been a sham? The sound, the light coming from out there, felt wrong. It wasn't a gentle lull or a siren's pull. It was dark and overpowering. Why had he given into it? Why had he done everything it wanted? How much of his life had been lived because of its needs and wants? One thing I could be sure of as I spent days listening to Ben's furious rampage on the exterior of the station, whatever had spoken to him, it was hostile and it couldn't be allowed to come back with me. Reynolds, I'm being told this is going to be a bit of unconventional pickup. I scoffed as I finished suiting up. That was an understatement. What did they tell you? I asked as I pulled the helmet down and initiated the door's opening sequence. There are concerns about contamination, the pilot told me. Not sure what that means. Didn't say if it was biological or chemical. All sounds a little weird if you ask me, but we're meant to pick you up mid-space walk. Is that right? Yup, I replied. Huh, you up for that? We're told we can come about 200 meters away, but you'll have to close the rest with the suit's thrusters. Gonna be something else for you. Untethered journey from one vehicle to the next. It's never been done before. I'm well aware of the risks, I said. Just keep your eyes peeled. This time it was his turn to scoff. For what? He cried. You'll know it when you see it. I made the journey with my back to the shuttle, floating in the wrong direction at a slow but consistent speed. My eyes glued to the station, looking for some signs of Ben. There was the occasional flash of something red, a slight shimmer of movement often obscured by some of the station's panels and antennae, that let me know he was still on the exterior, skulking around somewhere. So long as he stayed there, I knew I'd be okay. But the entire time I kept waiting for the other foot to drop. For the tension to finally explode into that life-threatening danger I knew was waiting for me. It came as a surprise when I finally approached the shuttle without incident. Pilot told me I was a few meters away and it was time to turn around, so I did, drifting around as gently as a diver. Returning to the surface. I had my back to the station no more than a few seconds when the pilot grunted. That's odd. He sounded nonchalant, but the object that hit me was anything but minor. Ben, uninterested in making the journey safely, had launched himself off the station as fast as he could. And with no way of slowing down, he hit me at full speed, slamming me up against part of the door frame and sending us both tumbling out into the void before anyone had even had the time to register his attack. This time he was not letting me get a door between us. He scrambled over my suit like a deranged insect, one that I desperately tried to swat away as the great void spun around us both. Stars turned to lines, the shuttle swooping past my helmet's field of view in almost random directions. It was sickening and terrifying, and I hoped to God I'd be able to correct the spin before it got out of control, but all of that came second to the monster who was clinging to my suit. At some point he crawled around in such a way that I got a good look at him, the first in a few days. It was up close, personal. Even with the helmet's glass between us, I could make out such stark and startling detail that I momentarily froze in terror, aware only vaguely of the pilot's panicked transmissions. Jesus Christ, what the fuck is that thing? Reynolds, you need to get yourself stabilized. Much further and we won't be able to help. And whatever you do, you need to know that fucking thing isn't coming aboard this shuttle. I wanted to reply, but I was busy trying to get an arm between me and Ben, who was now a profusion of jagged red crystals of varying sizes. Some as big as kitchen knives, others like sewing needles. A spacesuit's worst nightmare. A puncture wouldn't lead to the immediate decompression you're probably thinking of. Instead, I'd have a few moments at most before the air enveloping the suit dissipated, and after that my lungs would collapse, my blood would start to boil, and the water inside my eyes, nose, ears and other soft tissues would vaporize and try to escape, like frostbite on fast forward. But punctures weren't my sole concern. I knew I had to stop Ben's hands getting a grip on the helmet. I don't know if whatever had animated him had access to all his memories, but Ben sure as shit knew how to remove a helmet from the exterior, so all my focus went on keeping his nasty little fingers away from my neck. A puncture would still leave me enough time to return to the shuttle, but with no helmet I'd be doomed to a very painful death. So I fought the best I could, knowing everything hinged on me pushing him away. But Ben was lithe and insectal, constantly slipping out of reach whenever I got close to giving him a good shove. His fingers could easily find purchase on the suit and its many little greeblies, while I was basically wielding oven gloves that offered no dexterity. I had no hope of shaking him off the usual way, but I did have something on my side. Inertia. The whole time we'd been spinning furiously, and that rotational force was just about the only thing trying to peel the two of us apart. So far I'd been fighting it, but why? I realized at the last moment. I had one option left, so I jammed half thrusters on and decided to make the nearly out of control spin much worse. Normally an uncontrolled spin is one of those nightmare scenarios any astronaut dreads. Humans are irregularly shaped, and once you start rotating along more than one axis, applying more force is likely just to make it worse. Correcting takes a huge amount of experience and insight, and even then there's no guarantee you can stop it. More likely is that by the time you figure out what you need to do, the rotational forces will have you on the brink of unconsciousness. And from there, death is just a stone's throw away. For me, it was the only chance I had. So I accelerated the spin and kept accelerating, holding the button down until the forces at play pulled Ben further and further towards the front of the suit. That's where inertia wanted us. Two objects in near symmetry, ready to break off in opposite directions at any moment. Ben held on for longer than I did. At some point my limbs went weak, my vision dark, and my arms fell to my side, no longer able to fight the monster off. But by then it took everything Ben had just to cling on to me, and he could no longer attack or fumble at my helmet. Eventually, even he had to give in as the spin grew faster and faster and the forces trying to separate us grew too strong. It was like every roller coaster I'd been on merged into one and ramped up to 11. The last thing I remembered before I lost consciousness was the sight of Ben's monstrous face being flung off into the void. I came to aboard the shuttle, several men and women crowded around me. Jesus Christ, you're a lucky son of Fabbage. I groaned and made eyes towards the person who had spoken. It sounded like the pilot. Nice to put a face to the voice. I don't feel lucky, I gasped. You spun right towards us. We were already suited up and on our way. Timed up well. That suit was riddled with holes. Any later and we wouldn't have been around to catch you and get you into safety. As it is, pal, you're going home. Medical check shows no real issues. I think you're going to be okay. Where's Ben? The people around me shared a funny look before one of them realized. Benjamin Waitley? The other astronaut on board. Is that who was attacking you? I nodded. Well, he's gone, they replied. If that really was your colleague, we're sorry. I feel like there's a story we're missing. I'll catch you up when I'm feeling better, I coughed. Well, whatever happened to him, he'll be re-entering Earth's atmosphere in the next hours, the pilot replied. What then? I asked. The pilot thought for a second. Human body on re-entry? He'll go up in flames. I'm the sole survivor of a roller coaster that couldn't be stopped for 12 hours last year. I learned a lesson I will never forget. Trust your gut. I had the day off from work. I wanted to do something fun, but everyone I knew was busy. Makes sense. I mean, it was a Tuesday. I decided I'd just go to the amusement park by myself. I've done it before and had a great time. I'm a bit of a thrill seeker. Well, not too much anymore. Going 5 miles over the speed limit is about all the excitement I want out of life anymore. I got to the park at around 2 p.m. It was slow. Even for a Tuesday. It gave me a sense of excitement because I knew I'd be able to ride a lot of rides without having to be there all day. At the same time, it gave me a weird, uncanny feeling. All this space and not enough people to fill it up. I ignored the feeling and moved on. I don't know about you, but whenever I go to an amusement park, I like to work my way up to the really crazy rides. I'll start small and finish off the day with my favorite. My favorite just happened to be called the Grim Reaper. It feels a little too on the nose, doesn't it? It was 7:30 p.m., and the park closed at 8 p.m. And I knew it was time to get in line for my final ride. I also made a new friend while there. We met standing in line at one of my first rides of the day. We decided after chatting the whole time in line that we'd hang out for the rest of the day. His name was Charlie. We agreed on every ride that day. Except for the last. He wanted to end the night on the Mindbinder, but after some convincing, the Mindbinder's line was way shorter while passing by. We decided to do the Grim Reaper last. We got in line for the Grim Reaper and there was hardly anyone in line. It made sense given that it was almost closing time. Do you think they will let us ride multiple times if the line stays down? Charlie said with his hands clasped excitedly in front of him. I just smiled at him and chuckled. Normally I would have been excited too, but something in my gut felt so off. For some reason, I didn't want to go on one of my favorite rides. Maybe it was the 5 corn dogs I ate a couple hours earlier, I figured. I'm a very rational person. I wasn't the kind of person to let anxiety or worry rule over me. I always thought life was just what you made of it. When we got in line, there were about 60 people, give or take. The people in front of us did their ride and 30 of us were left in line. People started looking at the time and saying they were tired and just getting out of line. By the time it was our turn, only 19 people were in line. I knew the ride well enough to remember that it held 20 people, so if no one else got in line, they really might let us go multiple times. I really didn't want that though. Honestly, I felt even more compelled to get out of line after all those others did too. And I didn't want to seem lame to my new friend if I wanted to get off the coaster after one ride. The time came for us to get on the ride. My heart was pounding faster than it ever had. I wondered if I was all worked up because I watched Final Destination 3 with a friend a couple weeks back. But I wasn't having visions of the terrible fate we would all face. I was just feeling off. I did everything in my power to get it to all make sense and to not worry, but nothing worked. I seriously considered just telling Charlie I didn't feel great after the last ride, but I finally found someone with my taste in roller coasters. I didn't want to let him down. We were towards the back of the line, so we didn't have much say in where we sat. We ended up in the third car from the front. I was just happy we weren't in the front car. As you get on the Grim Reaper, it plays a cheesy little jingle. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, the Grim Reaper will find you dead or alive. With music in the background that always sounded so dumb in the past. I couldn't believe it was getting to me. Charlie even hummed along to it while grabbing my arm with happiness. We got in our seats, and an employee came by and pulled down the metal bar restraint to secure us in our seats. It was the kind that strapped you individually over your shoulder. I'm on the chubbier side, but I can always fit into coaster seats. I've never been told I couldn't go on a ride. I'm just sometimes a little snug. It's actually kind of nice because I feel very secure. As we got strapped in, I felt the plastic-coated metal hit my shoulders and chest. It should have given me a sense of comfort and safety, but I just felt trapped. The employee walked back to the station that has the infamous big button that starts the ride. He flashed all a thumbs up and yelled, "Ready for the Reaper?" Everyone raised their hands and let out an excited scream. Except for me. I let out a large sigh, counting down the seconds, trying to imagine Charlie and I once we were off the ride and how happy we would be. The employee hit the button and we were. The coaster shot out of the loading station like we were a bullet being shot out of a gun. After that, it started on a relatively slow ascent up a point to a drop-off of 60 degrees, a couple of twists and turns, a big loop, and some more twists and turns. About halfway through the ride, I was enjoying myself. I was thinking about how the hard part was done and I was safe. Just a little anxiety was all. We were rounding out our last bend when a sense of relief came over me. I could see the end of the ride. I was almost done. But the ride didn't start to slow down. Normally, the coaster starts to slowly come to a full stop several hundred feet from the end, but it was still going. As we passed by the loading area, I saw the operators look confused as we raced by. I noticed no one else was waiting in line. Someone screamed, "One more time." And everyone on board gave an excited response. Everyone except for me. Charlie looked over at me and grabbed my wrist. Yes. I knew they would let us keep going. This is awesome. He let out an excited yelp as we reached the climb to the drop. He was beaming with joy the whole rest of the lap. We passed by the loading area once again, but this time the coaster operator had a couple other people standing with him. The operator who strapped us looked red and worried. As we were whipped by the employees for our third ride of the day, the other riders were divided. Some were still excited, screaming, "Let's go! One more time!" Or "Best day ever!" Yeah. Some people started to sound scared. Not everyone noticed the employees looking frazzled. I can promise you one thing. I noticed. We started going up the incline again. This was the slowest part of the ride, at around 10 miles per hour and slowing down a little as it reached its peak. This gave us opportunities to take a breath or try to talk. Although it was only for a total of about 20 seconds. Are we stuck? I said nervously to Charlie. I'm sure we are fine. There is just a malfunction with the electrical system not activating the brakes or something. There is always a manual. Shut off. He was cut off and we went down the steep hill. We passed by yet again, this time with more people looking worried and someone standing close to where the coaster would go by. He tried to yell at us as we went by, but we couldn't really understand him. Maybe something about them working on getting us off. This time as we zoomed by, everyone was scared and starting to panic. I guess it didn't sink in for some people what was happening until right now. We went around a fifth time and everything remained the same. On the sixth time we were at the peak and saw a fire truck coming into the parking lot. From the top of the incline we had a perfect view of the parking lot, along with the side of a highway a little further out. It took 2 more loops around the track by the time the fire department got to us. Not just them but police officers and ambulances. It started to scare me. Why did they get ambulances? Is it just protocol or is there more to this? Someone came in a few minutes later with a big white board that they used to write messages to us. The ride was too loud when passing by them to hear anything, so this was their only way to talk to us. It must have been the 12th or 13th time around when the whiteboard read, "Trying to free you at peak." I knew they couldn't write a novel for us because you can only read so much while going by so fast, but come on, people, what is that supposed to mean? I think they just wanted to tell us they were working on a way to get us down, but that didn't matter. We had been on this ride for nearly 30 minutes and we felt sick and our bodies hurt like crazy. A couple loops after that, we saw a fire truck trying to get underneath where the top of the ascent was. Luckily, there was a large space where the truck could pull right beside it. Unfortunately, at its peak, it's about 200 feet in the air. It also didn't have any emergency exits at the top, like most coasters do. You'd think that would be a requirement, but what do I know? We saw the fire truck start to expand the ladder that comes out the top, but it wasn't even close. We waited for the firefighters to try and figure out a solution to save us, as the audience below us was watching us like we were some kind of show. It was close to 45 minutes when the first death occurred. Then one more soon after. There was a skinnier guy in a car behind me. I heard him talking about trying to slip out of the seat restraint, which secured him to his seat. The other guy he was with told him it was a bad idea. So did I. The next time we went up the ascent, he began violently wiggling and thrashing back and forth, to the point where people thought he was going to throw off the ride. He managed to wiggle about halfway out, right at the top. But well, it didn't end very well. His leg got caught on a part of the track and yanked the rest of his body out of the bar restraint. It sent his body crashing down towards the earth. However, I think he was dead soon after he was ripped out of his seat. I didn't see too much of it, but the guy who was beside him let out an insane screech. Hearing that kind of agony as you are feeling the harsh effects of gravity hitting on your chest while going down a steep hill was truly mortifying. The screech out of nowhere stopped and more people screamed. The man beside him had a heart attack. I could hear the symphony of moans and crying coming from the crowd watching us. I couldn't hear them before because of how loud the ride was, but they were terrified of what they saw. Police tried to escort them out of the park, but it didn't stop people from parking on the side of the road to watch and record on their phones. It made me feel disgusted. At around an hour on the ride, everyone stopped screaming or trying to talk to each other. It seemed like everyone accepted their fate. My nails were deeply embedded into Charlie's wrist. I couldn't scream anymore due to my throat feeling raw from the yelling. Even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't due to my voice giving out. I saw that I drew a little blood on Charlie, but he was too out of it to notice. He, along with a few other people, were incredibly sick. He threw up probably 5 times by this point and looked cross-eyed. Around that time, the electricity in the whole park shut down. All the lights, everything. I think they were hoping a hard reboot of the whole park would stop the ride. The coaster didn't just rely on gravity but also on a lot of help from motors and other electronic elements. It all turned off when we were on the straightaway. Of course, it still didn't stop. I could hear someone yelling with frustration, not understanding how it could still be moving if it didn't have an electrical source. After 2 hours, they let some family members come into the loading area, which was a terrible idea. We were doing our best to keep cool and stay calm. Our families washing us, zooming by them every 2 minutes and absolutely screaming at us, made it so much worse. My mom was my first family member to show up. Don't get me wrong. I love my mom, but she is very stubborn and wanted something done even though they had already tried everything. Of course, it was just because she wanted me safe, but it was stressing me out. The firefighters put down a safety net underneath the ascent. It was still quite a jump if we could even get out successfully to land on it. And we might be okay, but we were all a little scarred from what happened before. It seemed like they put it out just in case someone tried to get out again. It didn't seem like it was the plan to have us all just jump out of that moving death machine. They weren't desperate enough at that point. We saw a large group of people passionately arguing and yelling at each other. From what I could tell, it was made up of family members, firefighters, and some employees of the park. I'm sure with lots of varying opinions. The ride was on hour 3. When the coaster entered the loading area once again, I saw a woman run over to the control panel. A couple people ran over to her and told her to stop and not press the button. She was screaming her head off and wailing. It had been hard to understand people in the past while going by them, but this was as clear as day. As we passed by, I could tell she was starting to break free from the grip of people holding her back. I wasn't too worried. Whatever button she was wanting to press, I'm sure it wouldn't work since none of the other ones worked so far. We were about 5 seconds away from going down the descent when we heard a click come from all our seats. The woman hit the button that unlocked all our overhead seat belts. Of course, the seatbelt button worked, but not the button to stop the ride. A few people reacted fast enough to either jump out or snap it back over themselves before the ride went down. Others weren't so lucky. 3 people managed to jump out but didn't survive the fall. Despite there now being a giant net to catch anyone who was dumb enough to try and get out that high, one person hit a support beam on the way down, and the other 2 landed wrong when they hit the net. Their bodies folded in an unnatural manner. As they hit, all 3 died instantly. I would say around half of us that were left managed to get the seatbelt secured before going down the hill. Everyone else had to hold on for dear life. And unfortunately, I was one of them. I felt my stomach start to drop as I reached up to grab the only thing that would keep me from becoming a part of the pavement below. The restraint wasn't completely useless at this point. I just had a good 12 inches in between my chest and the restraint. As I dug my fingers into the plastic, I hoped I would be fine. Then the ride dropped. I felt my butt lift off the seat I had become so familiar with. I tried to wrap my ankles around the floor of the coaster to keep the rest of my body from flying out. Charlie luckily got the restraint down, so he was trying to get his leg over mine and hold me down with his arm. After the longest 5 seconds of my life, I managed to pull it back down over my chest. I wasn't sure who else got theirs down, but I assumed, from how scared a few of them sounded, it wasn't good. All I could think about and look at was the big loop coming up. As we got closer, I could hear swearing from multiple passengers, including someone in front of me. She was violently pulling at the restraint, but it just wasn't budging. I was hoping and praying that the centrifugal force would keep her in her seat. As we went around the big loop, I closed my eyes. I knew I didn't want to see what was about to happen. I heard multiple people screaming and making horrendous cracking sounds. I don't have an exact number, but I would say only 7 people were left. I could see the 2 people in the very front row and Charlie beside me. I recall only hearing 3 other voices behind me at this point. At hour 5, 3 more people died while on the ride. 2 of them from a heart attack or something. The third person, well, he watched the person beside him suddenly die while going around one of the bends. He yelled out in anger and well, I'd actually rather not go into detail. But he died soon after. I saw the whole thing. They were the 2 people left in front of me and Charlie. At hour 6, we saw a group of people bringing in what looked like another large net, except that it was in the loading area. The next time we looped around, they wrote something new on the big whiteboard. "We are going to try and stop it manually." I had no clue what this meant, but by the look of the net, I was terrified. The next pass, there were people on both sides of the loading area. On one side, the net was wrapped around a large pole that had been somehow fastened into the concrete slab. I saw a large, similar pole on the other side, but the net wasn't yet attached. As we zoomed by, I could hear people trying to rush and hurry behind us. We went around one of the turns and I cranked my neck, looking to see what plan they had in mind. They were frantically trying to tie the other side of the net to the support beam that was freshly drilled into the ground. I couldn't believe how stupid these people were. How on earth did they think this was a good idea? Was this a last-ditch attempt? I was yelling at them and telling them to stop, but of course they couldn't hear me. Even if they could, they wouldn't listen. They were desperate to get at least someone out of this alive. Or maybe the owner of the park wanted all of us to die so that no one could publicly talk about the horrific things we went through. As we went past the last bend, the hundreds of people watching the spectacle cheered, clapped, and celebrated, somehow not seeing any of the flaws with this terrible plan. We were on the straightaway and my heart started to pound again. The few seconds before we hit the net felt like slow motion. I swore I could see everyone's face. They looked happy. I couldn't believe it. It made me upset because I knew they were all about to be very disappointed. Finally, we hit the net. Of course, it was no match for a giant metal contraption hitting it. The metal pole was ripped out of the concrete slab and smashed down right in between our car and the one behind us. As we headed for the incline, we tried to get the net that attached itself to us off of the coaster. Luckily, we were able to get it off of us, but no luck with the metal beam that was now awkwardly lodged in the coaster. As we started going down, the whole ride started to shake violently. It felt like we were going to fly off the track. We made it to the first turn. I heard a loud snap and 2 screams. The 7 coaster cars behind ours broke off, and the metal beam found its way underneath. As we turned, I watched in disbelief as the cars behind us all went flying off the tracks. At that point in the ride, it was about 50 feet off the ground. Still enough to kill them. I wasn't fast enough to close my eyes and saw the whole thing. It went off the track like it had wings and suddenly plummeted down into the earth. The screaming immediately stopped when the ride landed upside down. My imagination filled in the blanks and shuddered at the thought of the carnage below me. And then, there were 2. We were hoping that somehow the ride would stop or slow down because we lost the back 7 cars. I was not sure what the logic was, but we were desperate at this point. After another hour, it was not showing any signs of slowing down. Once we made it to hour 8, we expected our fate. I was hoping that this would all be over soon and we could just be done. I don't think either one of us thought we'd get off. We just hoped at this point that our deaths would be quick. Over the next couple hours, we noticed a piece of metal on the car ahead of us start to wobble and loosen. I'm not sure if it was just the wear and tear of the ride going for so long or the whole net fiasco. It kept looking like it was about to come loose and we'd duck out of the way. We were imagining the worst possible outcome, thinking it would fly off and decapitate one of us. Eventually it did come off. But it wasn't a dramatic moment like we thought it would be. It was so much worse. Instead of coming all the way off, it only partially came off and started grinding loudly against the track. We heard an audible cringing sound from everyone watching below. The sound was horrendous. The thin strip of metal started to find its way underneath the car. Charlie was worried it would dislodge the coaster from its tracks like we saw just hours before. He told me he was going to try and grab it. I begged him not to. After a few laps of me telling him to just leave it, he made up his mind and contorted his body to try and grab the sharp metal. I couldn't see his hand as he reached down for it, but I could see his face. Somehow that made it worse. His expression quickly changed from focused to shocked in a matter of seconds. His face was blank. I heard screaming but had no clue what was going on. He lifted up his arm and I don't think I will ever be able to get the image of what used to be his arm out of my head. When he gripped the metal, it slipped and went deep into his forearm. Tried to grab his shoulder to calm him down, but to my shock he was calm. He was more silent at that moment than he had been the whole day. He wouldn't even look at me. He was almost mesmerized by the sight of his bloodied, disfigured arm. I felt lightheaded and had a ringing in my ears. Watching the blood start to make its way down his entire body, then to me in the floor of the coaster. It was making me feel sick watching the blood move around the car as we went around the twists and turns of the ride. Within minutes, Charlie looked like a ghost. I did my best to try and wrap his arm up with shreds of my shirt, but it was completely pointless. I don't think an old t-shirt can help when you see the bone. I tried to talk to him. I tried to make him feel as comfortable as I could, but it was no use. He was fading in and out of consciousness. We began going up the ascent and he finally looked over at me. I couldn't begin to explain all that I saw in his eyes. Could see the pain and sadness but also the relief. He knew he was going to die. But I don't think he cared. He gave me a weak nod of the head and looked ahead when we went down the hill. I tried to keep a close eye on him this lap, but it was honestly hard to look at him. I heard him take a deep breath right before the loop. When we finished the loop I looked over at him and, well, he was gone. I was now left alone in the death trap. I never imagined it could have gotten any worse. But having a dead body sitting next to you on a roller coaster is not something I would recommend. I was sitting in shock next to my dead friend for a couple hours. I was frozen in fear, not wanting to even think of a way out. After gaining some courage, I contemplated my next move. I came back into reality and realized the coaster was going just slightly slower. It wasn't significant, but if the loops were taking just slightly longer than before, that damn piece of metal that killed Charlie must have made its way underneath and not derailed it but slowed it down. I ended up taking off my shoes and Charlie's shoes. I had a plan that was probably dumb, but if I died at least it would be in my hands. As I went by the loading area, the coaster started to slow down just before the ascent. I threw all 4 shoes right in front of the ride. A part of a shoe caught the truck in just the right spot. The ride was still. I could feel the coaster almost pulsing, trying to move with all its might. I was sore. My shoulders were badly buried by the shoulder restraints, repeatedly hitting me over and over again. My whole lower half aching from sitting in a hard seat for hours on hours. I took a deep breath and squeezed in my gut like I never had before. I let out a horrific yell as I forced my body out of the restraint that had been holding me down for the last 12 hours. About 360 times around the track. My heart was racing as I felt the coaster start to win the battle to move again. I managed to squeeze out just seconds before it took off. I was freed and jumped. Luckily, I just barely hit the net below. I also managed to hit the net, so I didn't hurt myself too badly. Nothing is worse than what that ride already did to me. I laid on the net, looking up into the sky. In disbelief. I was still. I wasn't moving. It was almost making me feel motion sick not moving around. Like when you are reading a book in the car and you look up after an hour. Everything was blurry. I could barely hear the faint sound of people trying to get to me. But it was mostly just my ears ringing and my heart beating. After just a few minutes I was down. They immediately rushed me to the ER where I stayed for 3 weeks. I sustained a broken rib, a broken collarbone, severe bruising and a concussion just to name a few. Not to mention the mental trauma. I'm writing this as I'm feeling ready to finally tell my story. This is the first time I'm digging back into my memories and recollecting the whole experience. I started to work through all this with a therapist and it's made me realize I need to get it all out of my system. Don't bother trying to find anything about this story. The owners of the park have done a suspiciously good job hiding it. That's another reason I want to get my story out there. They have completely scrubbed the internet of it somehow. Although talking with a professional has helped, there are still some sounds and images that I can just never completely get out of my head. If you take one thing from my story, it's that you should trust yourself. Even if you don't believe in a higher power or gut instincts. If you have a feeling, trust it. Please. I'm blind. I'm not sure how many steps my staircase has. I've always been blind and that's fine by me. I'm glad I never got to see and then lose my sight. That would have been too depressing. Instead, I don't get to mourn something I've never had. I've lived in this Upper East Side flat for a really long time. As a writer, it's important for me to have my own space. I've been told my writing style is exquisite. Because I cannot see, I focus on the other senses and my writing shines by stimulating them. I don't say a red apple, red has no meaning for me. I say warm, firm and sour, a bit sweet, fits in your hand, smells of grass and childhood. I'm not gonna lie, this flat was nice for a while but really tiny. And I want to learn to play the piano. So, naturally, since I've saved up a lot of money from my works, I bought this beautiful mansion in the suburbs. At least, that's how my friends and family called it. I don't care, I can't see anyway. I just needed to feel the warm sunlight in the kitchen and the crisp air from my balcony, while I drink my coffee in the morning and listen to the birds. And I work, day and night. People thought it would be a problem if my house had an upper floor. Because, according to them, even if I've lived my whole life blind, I cook, chop up things, take baths and clean the house, I apparently can't climb some damn stairs. No problem for me. I counted the steps of my staircase. 14. Eventually, I got used to it and I even stared going up and down the stairs faster, since I knew exactly how many steps I needed to climb. That's the thing when you're blind. Some movements become reflexes. Since you live alone, you learn how to position certain things and you always find them in the same place. One day, however, I was going down the stairs and I tripped. Where I expected the floor to be, there was this additional step and I didn't think much of it. Figured I must have not paid attention. I mean, yes, it was odd because after 30 years of being blind, tripping wasn't really a common thing. But I didn't look much into it. However, when I went up again, I tripped at the top. That was definitely unusual. Sure as it was one extra step. I went back the stairs and counted. 15. Counted again. 14. The fuck? Sure enough, 14 steps. Whatever. I went to sleep. A few days passed and I didn't trip anymore. I played it off as some error my tired mind made. Then one night as I went downstairs to get a glass of water, I tripped again. This time I really fell down on my foot. That was not a skipped step. There were at least 2 additional steps. I felt around and stood up. My foot hurt a lot but the ankle was good. I couldn't really stand up on it but no serious damage. I went up, carefully counting. 16. What the fuck? Sure, you mess up you count 1 more or 1 less. But 2 more? The house was so still, so silent. No birds, no bees, no cars passing. Normal people fear the darkness, I fear the silence. I went down the stairs again counting. By the time I reached the bottom, I counted 14. Again. I went up again. 18. That was absolutely ridiculous. Was someone messing with me? How could they even mess with me like that? I've never heard of a burglar to break into someone's house and add steps to their stairs. Still, I went to check to see if I locked the door. I can make my way around pretty neat. Went through the kitchen, then into the hallway. And then I bumped into something. I froze. My organs tensed up, my hair stood up, all ears. I had never felt so much fear in my life. Decided to go on and check the door. Yeah, locked. I made my way back upstairs and this time I didn't bump into anything. Or anyone. For fuck's sake. All night, all I did was go up and down like a lunatic. Each time I got different results. Back upstairs, I decided to go down and make one final count. 14. Okay, it is probably going to be more. 15. Nope, still going. 17. 19. 21. That's a record. 27. 33. That could not be possible. 52. 88. I could absolutely feel the sense of impending doom. Something was there with me. And it was vile, disgusting, and unnatural. And this staircase was never ending. 102. I finally gave up. Whatever this was, I didn't want to reach the bottom. I went back up. The moment I turned my back to go up, I tried to be brave, but something got over me and I ran on all fours, desperate to reach the top, desperate to run back to my bedroom. I don't remember how I got inside and locked my door, but I did. And now I'm sitting here and typing. This house is strange. It is eerie and disturbing. And I think if I'd gotten to the bottom of the staircase, I would have left this world. I don't think that was my house anymore. However, no matter what stupid, cryptic, eerie, unnatural staircase I unveiled, it is important not only that I don't go down there but that nothing comes up either. And right now I can hear it creaking. Every night a different person walks down the street and screams for help. We aren't allowed to help them. Looking back, I feel dumb. Completely stupid, actually. I should have known that apartment was far too cheap to be right even for a studio. I should have known there had to be a catch. The day I moved in was a complete blur. I insisted that no one help me, not wanting to prove any of my family members' suspicions about my character. By late afternoon, all my muscles ached terribly and my head throbbed. I fell back on my bare mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan with glazed-over eyes. I pulled the damp strands of hair from my sweaty forehead, wincing in disgust. Someone knocked on my door, causing me to jump. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up on my elbows. Two girls were peeking around my door frame. Foolishly, I had left it wide open, forgetting the old college rule. Only leave your door open if you want to make new friends. And I was not in the mood to make new friends. One of them, an Asian girl with choppy black hair, was grinning at me. The other stood a little further back, fingering a box of Marlboro Reds. "Hey," she said, nodding at me. Her voice was smooth and raspy at the same time. "Did you just move in?" I laid back down, rubbing my face with both hands, choosing not to bother with manners. "Yeah. About 5 seconds ago." "Cool." The girls walked in, evidently ignoring my very clear body language. The girl with the black hair ran her fingers along the edge of my desk, and then picked up a little ceramic duck from my unpacked box of trinkets. "Grandma," I explained, feeling strangely defensive. "Cute," she replied, holding it up to her face. "Has anyone told you yet?" The other girl asked abruptly, looking around my apartment. She had tucked the cigarettes into the back pocket of her jeans, and was now tugging at her long red braids. "Jesus, Gianna, give her a second." "Well, she needs to know." "Yeah, but we haven't even asked her name." I blinked at the two strangers incredulously. I hadn't even had time to put toilet paper in my bathroom, and here they were, touching my things and talking about me like I wasn't there. I just wanted to take a nap, honestly. "My name's Arden," I said. The girl with the red braids, Gianna, sat down next to me on my bed. "Did they tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Oh, of course they didn't. The rules." I blinked again, my face blank. I didn't know about any rules besides the typical renting ones. I had signed the lease after, at best, skimming over it. The landlord was a skinny woman who smelled of ashes, and I was fairly certain she had never developed the facial muscles necessary for smiling. I wasn't about to ask her any follow-up questions, especially when the rent was so cheap. The other girl laughed nervously. "Where did you move here from?" I ignored her. "What rules?" Gianna got a strange, wicked sort of smile on her face, bouncing a little on my mattress. The other girl sighed loudly. "Something happens here every night," she began, pulling out my rickety office chair and sitting down. "Something weird." "Like what?" I sat up, frowning at her. Finally, my interest was piqued. "Someone walks down the street," Gianna said, her voice reminding me of a camp counselor telling a scary story around the bonfire. "That one right down there." She pointed at my window. "It's someone different each night. They scream for help for about an hour. But we aren't supposed to help them." I just stared at her. I felt a small chill run up my spine. I didn't know what to make of all this. "It happens at a different time every night," the other one said softly. "We never know when it's coming." "Why?" She shrugged almost sadly. "We don't know why." I scoffed, leaning my elbows against my knees. "I don't believe you." The girl shrugged. "You don't have to. You'll see for yourself." The look in her eyes made me want to believe her. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't even begin to fathom what they were saying being true. It was too strange, too outlandish. I knew this wouldn't be the nicest neighborhood, but it couldn't be that bad. It had to be a prank, they had to be hazing me or something. "We'll come back later," Gianna said matter-of-factly. "We'll show you." Before I could protest, she grabbed the other girl by the wrist and they were gone. I followed them to the door, watching them march down the hall, talking to each other in hushed voices. I closed my door behind them. That night, as promised, they came back. They came dragging along two boys. One was somewhat muscular, wearing a tight black t-shirt and baggy jeans, and my eyes were instantly drawn to a silver heart-shaped locket around his neck. He smiled at me and introduced himself as Will when he walked in. The other boy was smaller but chubbier and nervous-looking, with a buzz cut and ill-fitting cargo shorts. His name, I was told, was Mateo. The girl named Gianna came in carrying a bottle of wine, and that same slightly crumpled box of cigarettes. The other one, the girl I still didn't know the name of, was the only one who looked even somewhat apologetic. They all sat down on my dusty floor next to the window and motioned for me to join them. I sat between Will and the nameless girl, unsure whether I should continue feeling violated or if I should just give in to my strange, pushy neighbors. "Do you all live in this building?" I asked, hesitantly accepting the wine when it was passed to me. Yeah, Will answered with a grin. It seemed half-hearted. This building is where all the young people live. It's where they put us, Gianna cut in, lighting a cigarette. It didn't even occur to me to tell her not to smoke inside. We've all been sorted out. Fokiwihia. She's a bit of a conspiracy theorist. It's not a theory, she snapped, glaring at him. Look at the other ones. Next door, the middle-agers. People with kids but no grandkids. Across the street, old people. Not a single 20-something in that entire building. May, tell him. So her name was May. I looked her over, admiring her smoky eye makeup and how she tied her hair up, long strands poking out like exploding fireworks. Stop it, May muttered, reaching for the wine bottle. You'll scare her. I'm not scared. She just shrugged at me as if she didn't believe me. We passed the bottle around and then around again. I listened to them bicker and laugh. It was clear they'd all been friends for a while, and I felt a little bit like I was intruding, even though they were in my apartment. Will asked me if I had gone to college, and I told him I did, but I dropped out. They all nodded sympathetically, which made me feel stupid. By midnight, I was a little bit buzzed and my guard was beginning to fall. I had to admit it felt good to have friends. I had already mentally resigned myself to a life of solitude, at least for a while, but it seemed that might not actually have to be my fate. I laughed at Matteo and Gianna's drunken argument, passing a cigarette back and forth with May, blowing the smoke out of my open window. I had almost completely forgotten why they were all over when it happened. All at once, a blaring alarm came from each of our phones like an Amber Alert. I could hear the sound echo throughout the neighborhood, like an entire chorus of hundreds of phones going off, not just ours. I nearly leapt out of my skin. Not even Gianna laughed. All of them went quiet and they looked at me as I took it out, frowning at the screen. Do not interfere. It's coming, Will whispered. He had changed, his eyes almost glassy and his voice soft and shaky. Matteo squeezed his shoulder. I looked at May. Her eyebrows were cinched together in concern, and she was stubbing out our cigarette against the windowsill, shrinking away. There was again that chill. It crept up my back, spreading along my scalp and making me shiver. Something felt deeply, deeply wrong. The others were quiet now, staring silently at the window I was sitting up against. The air felt somehow warmer, like it was buzzing with something, or maybe I was just sweating. We sat there, unmoving, for what felt like half an hour. Right as I was getting tempted to ask what was going on, I heard it. It was far away and faint, but I still heard it. A cry. It continued as it got gradually closer, louder, more desperate. Help, please, my God, someone help me. Slowly I leaned out the window. I had to see it with my eyes, had to confirm there was actually someone out there like they had said there would be. My new apartment was on the 4th floor, so it was hard to see who was down on the street without squinting. In the flickering street lights, I could make out the outline of an elderly man. He was hunched over, wandering aimlessly from door to door, wearing only what looked like a hospital gown to cover his pale, broken body. Behind him trailed a path of dripping blood, although I couldn't see where it was coming from. Please? I'm hurt. I looked back at the others, my mouth hanging open. What is this? I demanded loudly. What the hell is this? May touched my arm, trying to calm me down. I pulled away from her. Arden, please. We have to help him. Why can't we help him? He's just an old man. We can't help him. Trust me. I ignored her, leaning further out the window, prepared to call out to him. Before I could open my mouth, I froze. The man down there was still now, facing our building. His head was tilted upwards and I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking right at me. I immediately felt cold, like I was plummeting into ice water. Help me, he whimpered into the silent night air, his voice barely audible. Then he began to scream. That scream wasn't human. Or at least not any human I had ever met. It was desperate, agonized. It made my stomach turn and my eyes prick with tears. I couldn't look away. The blood was coming from his arms. Or I should say, his lack of arms. Where his arms should have been, there were only bloody, mangled stumps. They looked fresh. He didn't move other than a shaky sway, and his eyes didn't leave me. His shriek slowly molded into words that I could just barely understand. Please, 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 please. May yanked me backwards, away from the window. I landed on my ass and yelped in pain and horror. What is that thing? I whispered. I didn't mean to whisper, but that was all that came out. We don't know, May replied, her eyes trained on Will, who was crying now. Matteo held on to him like he might topple over. We just know to follow the rules. What happens if you don't follow the rules? I asked and immediately regretted it. Will sobbed softly. Outside, the old man wailed. Gianna reached over and pulled the window shut, but it somehow did nothing to muffle the blood-curdling sound. Do you want to tell her, or should I? Matteo asked Will. Will just shook his head. He was clutching his locket now, turning the little heart over between his fingers. Matteo sighed and turned towards me. A couple of months ago, one of them got to Will's girl. Shannon, Gianna butted in. Her name was Shannon. Sorry? Her name is Shannon. I swallowed, but whatever I did, nothing would force down the lump in my throat. What happened? Matteo shook his head. We don't know, we were all together when the screaming started. Usually we just ignore it now, you know? No use in dwelling on it. But that night, we think she saw something different. She started insisting she had to help and she ran outside. We couldn't stop her. He paused, glancing over at Will. He was silent and still. The screaming outside had begun to pass, getting softer as it continued further down the street. Then what? He shrugged. Nothing. She was just gone. I pressed my lips together, trying to process all of this. I really had believed they were messing with me, but I had seen it, I had witnessed it firsthand. And it terrified me. Why doesn't anyone leave? He shrugged for a second time. Can't afford it. Or people just don't care. Some people have left, but we all signed an NDA with the lease, so nobody ever knows. I frowned, thinking back to signing the paperwork, trying to remember. I could vaguely picture what he was talking about. I had just assumed it was more legal jargon that I would never understand. Had I seriously signed a non-disclosure agreement without even noticing? After that, I told them I wanted to go to bed. I needed time to process all of this. They understood, and each one of them said goodbye before leaving me alone. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, for some strange reason I thought of May's face when we had realized it was happening. How she'd put out the cigarette and backed away from the window. Eventually, I was able to drift off to sleep. The next few weeks were difficult. I spent more and more time with my new neighbors. I came to find that they were right. I didn't think there was a single person older than 30 in our entire building, but I saw them all the time, leaving the one next door. Settling in was difficult. The others seemed so used to it, they cared. Of course it scared them, especially Will. But you could tell they had been here a while by the way they sighed, closing the blinds and focusing harder on whatever they were doing. Eventually, I began to mimic them. It helped a little bit to pretend it was normal, as strange as that sounds. Moving out wasn't really an option for me anyways. I was a college dropout and I hadn't found a job yet. I was still just getting by on what I had managed to save up. Every night it was someone different. Some were more human, some seemed less. Some were drenched in blood, their clothes ripped and strange, but some looked fairly normal. The worst were the children. They would run like injured chickens, screeching and banging on doors, begging for help. Sometimes they would try different things, say different things, like they're coming, like I don't want to die, or even I'm sorry. There were a lot of children. One night, while I was half awake, an alarm went off. It wasn't like the one on our phones. It was blaring, only somewhat muffled by my window. My apartment glowed a flashing red from outside. I didn't even look. I was too scared of what I might see. I just covered my head with my pillow and tried to fall back asleep. I came to learn all of the theories, especially from Gianna. She thought we had all been chosen and predetermined to live here, all for some sick little government game. She thought maybe there were people betting on the different buildings, putting down money on who would interfere the least. See that? She said to me one day in the hallway, returning from a coffee run. Cameras everywhere. I didn't know if I believed her. I spent time with May mostly. We smoked on the front steps and people watched. It was strange to see what at night was such a sinister and gruesome neighborhood, during the day bright and lively. She didn't talk much about the rules. So I didn't either. We didn't talk all that much in general, I found, just enjoying each other's company. Right when I was beginning to feel comfortable was when it happened. It started with a birthday cake. Happy birthday. As May walked through the door, Matteo blew into his plastic party horn. The paper inflated, smacking Will on the side of the head. May's hand flew to her heart. Jesus Christ. You fuckers know I hate surprises. Gianna laughed and walked over to her. In her hand she held a chocolate cake, haphazardly adorned with sprinkles and bright pink icing that read, Happy Birthday Amy, in the center. 24. She set down the cake on the dresser and threw her arm around May's neck. How does it feel? Fucking awful. That's the spirit. Enough of this, Matteo cut in, weaving between them. Let's eat some cake, then let's go. Their tradition, I had learned, was to bar hop for birthdays. They told me there was no curfew here, despite the rules, just a recommended time to be home, which was 10:30 p.m. Usually they said they got home before the alarm or spent the night somewhere else. We all took some cake. The boys took shots in the kitchen to pregame while I watched Gianna fuss over May's hair. I was never much of a partier. While at clubs or bars in college, I spent most of the time out back chatting with the smokers. But then again, I was never much of a friend group person either, so maybe the circumstances were changing. I watched them all troop outside to Mateo's car. I stuffed myself in the back, incredibly conscious of how close I was pressed into May, my other shoulder rammed into the car door. Mateo's music, cranked up to maximum volume, hurt my ears, and the tiny space was packed with the smell of tobacco and various perfumes as we sped down the freeway toward the city, but it was nice. It was really nice. I found myself laughing with them, and I hooked my arm around May's when she weaseled her hand beneath my elbow. It was actually nice. As predicted, the bars they chose weren't exactly my scene. But this time, as opposed to college, I could stand it. I took shots, I followed them out for smoke breaks, I even danced under the low purple lights until my feet ached inside my chunky heels, surely riddled with blisters. By the time we got to our third bar, I couldn't even feel it anymore. And it was at that third bar that we crammed ourselves into an old photo booth, and Gianna reluctantly offered $5 to the slot, and we laughed, red-faced, into a tiny camera. After the photos spit out into the compartment, the others slid through the red curtains, but before I could follow, May grabbed my wrist. She held me back, sliding her long baby blue nails up my wrist. I shivered. "You never gave me a birthday present," she whispered, and I could feel her breath on my face. If I was wearing my glasses, they would have been fogging up. Yeah, well, I didn't get to finish my quip before she kissed me. It was nice. And then it wasn't. "Hey," Will called out to me, squeezing through a crowd of men wearing tattered leather jackets to get to me. "Arden, where's everybody else?" I blinked, looking around. I could have sworn they had been right there a second ago, but now none of them were anywhere to be found. I shrugged. "Dunno." "Why, what's up?" He finally broke free from the swaying mass and I got a better look at him. He looked worried. His face was flushed and I could see a few drops of sweat creeping out from his hairline. He took his phone out of his pocket and held it out to me. First I saw his home screen. It was him next to a girl with strawberry blonde hair, both clutching beer bottles and grinning widely at the camera. Then I looked where he actually wanted me to. The time. 1:47 a.m. "It's getting late," he narrated. "Can we find the others and get going?" I understood then. He was worried. It was past 1 a.m. and no alarm yet. It was later than usual. The bars would start closing soon. He wanted to get back before it happened. Will and I weaved through the crowd. I was pretty buzzed and I realized I was having a hard time moving my feet right, which made me feel embarrassed. I hadn't even had that much to drink. Was I that much of a lightweight? We found them outside, chain smoking. Will explained the situation while I swayed. The drive back was strangely tense. Mateo's music was turned down, and there wasn't any joking or boisterous gossiping like there had been on the way out. We all felt it didn't need to be said. Something was off. Will drove fast, almost reckless. In the dark, May took my hand. Just as he was careening around the last corner, and we could almost make out the shape of our apartment building down the street, it happened. All of our phones went off at once. Gianna let out a small shriek from the other side of the back seat. "Do not interfere." Mateo turned back towards us, pressing his finger to his lips. Had this ever happened before? By their reactions, I didn't think so. It was different when it came when I was in my bedroom, when I could just shut the curtains and put my headphones on. I felt so small and helpless then, like I was gazing into the maw of something incomprehensibly beyond my understanding. I felt like we were all flies and this neighborhood right now was the spider's web. Will drove slowly now. Maybe 5 miles an hour. We were all still, we were all silent. Not even a stray breath cut through the quiet. Underneath the glowing street lights, I could make out the side of Will's face. He was pale, and if I hadn't seen his knee shifting as he pressed down on the brakes, I could have mistaken him for a mannequin. The car came to a stop. I followed his gaze, all the way down the street to the dark horizon. And I saw what he saw. A silhouette. It was far too distant to make out what shape it took, but it was evidently humanoid. It moved in a shaky stumble, limping down the middle of the road in our direction. And in the overwhelming silence, I could hear it, far away but still deeply urgent. "Help me, Will," Gianna hissed. "Turn the car around." Will didn't move. He just stared forward, as white as paper. It didn't make any logical sense, but I knew what he knew. It was too late now. There was no use. "Help me, please help." I could tell now that it was a girl from its voice and its figure as it got closer. It was wearing some sort of white nightgown, not unlike the old man's hospital attire from that first night, stained with dark red blood. From here I couldn't tell if it was fresh or dry. I didn't know why that mattered to me. Maybe, May whispered. Her arm shook against mine. Maybe if we're quiet and we duck down it won't see us. Deep down it felt as hopeless as turning around had felt, but it seemed reasonable. I nodded and did as she suggested, crouching behind the passenger seat, my knees throbbing from the strange angle I'd bent myself into. We all did it except for Will. He didn't move. He still just looked. When he finally spoke I could barely hear him, it was so weak. Shannon? The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mateo was the one to break the silence. What? Shannon? He repeated, finally turning to look at his friend. That's Shannon. I peered over the seat in front of me, squinting my eyes. The human-like thing was getting closer, and now I could make out strawberry blonde hair, round face, short legs. The girl from Will's phone lock screen. The girl who had disappeared. Shannon. May gasped next to me. Dude, Mateo said slowly, his words crumbling as soon as they left his mouth. I know what you're thinking, dude. Do not get out of this car. Will didn't even seem like he was with us anymore. He was in shock, I think, looking back. I have to help her, he insisted, right as another sickening cry rang out. Help me. Help. Help me, please, someone, it hurts. It was getting far too close to us for comfort, but it still didn't seem to notice the car. Its cries became more and more desperate as they got louder. I have to help her, Will repeated, and a bit of life had returned to his face. Mateo shook his head and grabbed at his sleeve. Will, that is not Shannon. Will glared at him, his eyes shining with tears. I know Shannon. That's her. I know you do, dude, and I know you miss her, but please, please don't do this. Their voices were getting louder and more distraught, and I felt May press into my side, trembling like a leaf. Gianna was whimpering, but I couldn't see her from my position. The thing was almost to our car when it stopped. She turned her head left, then right, almost like she was sniffing the air. The boys stopped arguing. I felt like my heart would burst out of my chest. I could see Shannon's face now, and I realized why she hadn't seen us. The girl's face was streaked with gore, and it looked like her eyes had been scooped out with a melon spoon. She cried, drool pouring from her slackened mouth, but no tears could come. It happened too quickly. None of us could stop him. Will violently ripped his arm away from Mateo, fumbling for the handle to the car door. Gianna screamed. Mateo tried to slam down on the lock, but he missed, and Will managed to get the door open before he could try again. He stumbled onto the asphalt and hit the ground with a soft crunch. The thing turned her head and began to scream. But instead of charging at Will, she backed away. She held her arms out in front of her like something might attack her, whipping her head around wildly. An alarm went off like the one I had heard that one night, but far more unbearable now that I was in it. The streetlights lining either side of the street switched to a flashing red, and Mateo threw himself into the driver's seat, the tires screeching as he peeled away. Gianna was screaming at him, pleading with him to go back. May was weeping into her hands. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't understand. As we sped away I looked back. I couldn't help it. I saw the flash of some sort of van in the blinding red light, pulling around the corner. Then nothing. That was a week or two ago. I don't know. I've been having a hard time keeping track of time. None of us have spoken much since that night. We tried the police, of course, but as you could assume, nothing came of it. I think whatever this is far larger than we know. I don't know if it's some kind of experiment or just a sick game, but I'm going to move back into my parents' house next week, despite all their berating, and then figure out what to do from there. I don't know if that was really Shannon that we saw that night, or if it was something else, and I don't know which is worse. All I know is that last night, I heard Will's voice outside my window, crying, pleading for help. I didn't interfere. There's a death row inmate who we've executed over a dozen times. He won't stay dead. We killed Joseph Glass for the first time on August 18, 1999. I knew he was a strange case since day one. Never seen a guy so happy to die before. It was like we were doing him a favor. He refused the automatic appeal. He refused to be seen by a chaplain. He just wanted it over with. It had only taken a little over a year, and it was already time for him to make his appointment with God. He freaked me out just passing by his cell. He was like our very own Hannibal Lecter, the way he just stood there in the back of his cell like he'd been waiting for you. The lights always burned out in any cell he was in, and maintenance had gotten tired of fixing them. Not that he seemed to mind in the slightest. The darkness seemed to swallow his top half, and all I could see were the whites of his beady little eyes poking out of all that black. Billy drummed his baton against the bars. "Up and at him, cowpoke," he called in that mocking tone. "Time finally come for you to pay what you owe, you sick son of a Billy." Warden Taft silenced him with a word. "If you can't act like a professional, you're going to have to sit this one out." Billy paused, and licked his chapped lips. "Nah," he muttered. "This a show I can't miss." Glass seemed to tick Billy off more than any prisoner before him. He liked them to at least pretend to feel sorry for what they've done, or act scared of what's coming to him. This one didn't even have the common decency to shed a tear. He was as stone-faced as a statue, even while being marched to the chair. Billy liked to joke sometimes that we ought to take the guy out back with some car batteries and really put the fear of God into him, get him to cut out that stoic act. I think he was only half joking. After what this guy did to those girls, well, Billy has a daughter, so I guess it struck a chord. We all watched him fry. The warden, his closest men. The thin-faced man representing the commissioner of corrections. The prison physician. The families of those poor girls. It couldn't have gone more by the book. Only oddity I'd noticed at the time was that the stench of death never quite left the clothes I'd worn that day. And then the next morning, we came into work to see the whites of those beady little eyes staring at us from the darkness again. "Good morning, sirs," he said, just as he did every morning in that airy, hoarse little voice. I'll admit it. I dropped everything I was carrying, stumbled back, stammered like a confused child. Hell, I almost screamed. You're not, why you're supposed to be, I don't know what you mean, sir." He leaned in like he was trying to stare a hole through my chest. His tone almost sounded disappointed. "You never came for me. You promised me that yesterday would be the end, sir, but you never came. I waited all night long. Why did you lie to me?" Me and Taft looked at each other. We both had the exact same question on our minds. If Glass was still alive, who the hell did we roll into the morgue last night? Jesus Christ. Taft gagged when he pulled back the cadaver cover, stumbling away. "It's Billy." I looked. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. And I'll be forever haunted by the sight of my friend lying there on his back, mouth agape and cloudy eyes staring into the ceiling, open wide as if he'd spent his last moments in a state of terror. The public never found out what happened. The cover-up story was that poor Billy had been taken by cardiac arrest. Internally, it was the scandal to end all scandals. Worst case of incompetence and negligence in history, they called it. They brought the hammer down on anyone even tangentially involved. Me and Taft were out on our ears, and they would have prosecuted us too, but that would have required admitting it ever happened. But I just could never wrap my head around it. Of those dozens of witnesses, not a single person noticed we were strapping a guard to the chair, not an inmate. It was impossible to the point of absurdity. Glass had been the man in that chair. I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Some months later, I noticed power flickering off all over the city one evening. It was brief, so I thought nothing of it, at least until I got a call from a familiar number the very next morning. "I understand you were one of the staff who regularly worked with one Joseph Glass. We would like to consult with you about an evolving situation." Oh. At 7 p.m. yesterday, we attempted the execution of Joseph Glass for the second time. There was a long pause, and when the voice returned, the professionalism had melted away, replaced with a baffled anxiety. "And well, it didn't work." I blinked. "It didn't what?" There came a long sigh. "Perhaps it'd be best if you saw for yourself." And just like that, me and Taft had our jobs back. Officially, Joseph Glass had been successfully executed on August 18, 1999. Unofficially, they tried again 6 months later, just to tie up loose ends. This time, he hadn't even had the courtesy to pretend to die. He just sat there on the chair, motionless and unaffected, while the CO who'd flipped the switch suddenly seized up and began to convulse, screaming and gnashing and wailing as electricity seared him beneath. His skin, clawing at his chest until his eyes popped in his skull and rolled down his face like melted candle wax. All around him, lights flickering, machines bursting from pressure, electrical panels vomiting arcs of static. It was a mess. The feds were crawling all over this case now, from a department I've never heard of. Something about investigating preternatural activity. They told me Glass was refusing to speak with anybody but the COs who'd once cared for him. Being walked into that interrogation room almost made me feel like I, myself, was a convict being marched to his execution. Glass was staring at me when I walked in, like he'd been sat there, motionless, waiting for me. I expected nothing less. I took a shuddering breath as I sat across from him. I'd sat across from serial killers and psychos before and showed no hint of fear. But how could I not, now, sitting across from a man who can kill people without touching them? Glass. Officer Mendez. His tone betrayed no emotion. I had thought you'd abandoned me. I winced. No. No, Glass, I'd just been temporarily relieved. It's good to see you again. Would you like a glass of water? I offered it to him. He didn't even look at it. His eyes just bored into mine, relentless. I'm here to ask you a few questions. Silence. Okay. Glass, I need to know how you killed Billy and Kramer. I didn't, he replied. It did. The thing standing behind you. I didn't bother to turn around. I had enough experience with prisoners trying to trick me into looking the other way while they pulled off some half-baked escape plan. Glass, please, let's take this seriously, I replied. I've always treated you with respect, haven't I? You've never had any problems with me. Actually, I do. I have a problem with all of you. Oh. You here all believe that death is a punishment. There was the first hint of emotion I'd ever heard in his voice. It's not. It's freedom, the only freedom. You promised me that gift. You promised me you'd let me die. You've given it to so many other prisoners while leaving me behind. With all of your machines and your science and your knowledge, surely you can find a way, if anyone. My throat felt suddenly dry. Had to take a sip of the water myself and hoped it would quell my burning nerves. We're trying our best, Glass. But you have to work with us. It may help if you told us what exactly is preventing us from executing you. He moved for the first time, leaning in so slow as to be almost imperceptible. It won't let me die. And that's when I felt a hand settle on my shoulder from behind. Everything stopped. My lungs stopped inflating. I swear my heart stopped beating and my blood froze in place in my veins, and it all felt so cold. I could see the hand in the corner of my eyes, long and veiny and black. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I'd once mocked the way deers froze in headlights. Now I understood. I couldn't move, I couldn't blink, I couldn't think. I couldn't even take a single breath. Even as my lungs began to cry out for air, and my vision blurred, and my thoughts melded together, all I could see was Joseph's eyes staring into mine. Those infinite fathoms of darkness, that Stygian sea that swirled and stormed and thundered in the blackness of his iris, and the eyes of things waiting a million leagues below the waters. And I would have suffocated there, too terrified to even breathe, if those agents in black had not called off the interrogation then and come storming into the room. Later they showed me the tapes from the security camera. There'd been nothing behind me. Nothing placing its thin hand upon my shoulder. Nothing at all. On May 7, 2001, Glass was set to be executed for the third time, via hanging or so I heard, in some government black site somewhere far from prying eyes. While it was set to happen, me and Taft were sharing glasses of scotch in his office, nominally to celebrate. Really, because we were scared. Taft always struck me as young at heart despite his years, but this was the first time the warden had ever looked truly, properly old. He watched the yard below as he had a drink. Did I ever tell you why I chose this line of work, Mendez? I shook my head and he sighed. Back in '63, they found a woman's body in the back seat of a burnt-out car in some state park near my neighborhood. A prostitute. One of her Johns had chopped her up, burned all the evidence. And you know what got me, Mendez? Nobody cared. Nobody bothered to investigate. Who will notice one less hooker on the corner of Fifth Avenue, right? It didn't sit right with me. The way I see it, Mendez, every life matters. Even the ones we try and cast aside. Everybody's got people who love them and childhood memories and all that. Everybody deserves justice. No matter who they were. He set down his glass and looked me in the eyes. So I joined the force. Got the case reopened. Found the guy. And I watched him fry. And I like to imagine she was there watching too as he burned. There was a tense moment. And then a chuckle. Of course, after that bullet to the hip in '71, I couldn't walk the beat anymore. But I've been just as happy here. Watching justice be served, it makes me feel like there's some kind of karmic order to the world. Good deeds and bad deeds get repaid in kind. It was clear there was something lurking beneath his words, some unspoken thesis. Eventually, with old, wrinkled, tired eyes, he said it. I've thought about it, and if Glass doesn't die tonight, I'm finally going to retire, Mendez, he confessed. After what he did to those girls, what kind of order can there be in a world where a monster like that is just beyond justice? I was shocked. Warden Taft always struck me as an unmoving fixture. What would we do without him? He'll die, sir, I promised. It'll work this time. It has to. But he seemed deeply uncertain. With one last shuddering drink, he leaned forward. His eyes. He stared at my expression as if desperate for me to understand, for me to know. Those things, in his eyes. Haven't you seen them? And at that moment, Taft was yanked up out of his chair. It was so sudden, so inexplicable, I could barely register what I was witnessing. Some unseen force lifted him 2 or 3 feet above the ground, dangling him there. He choked, coughed and sputtered, desperate to gasp down air which would not come, and clawed at something around his neck which I could not see. He was hanging, I realized, and with wide, horrified eyes, the same as Billy's had been, he silently begged me for help. I sprang from my chair and wrapped my arms around his dangling legs. At first I tried to pull him down to the floor, but I realized it was only tightening the invisible noose around his neck. Then I tried lifting him as high as I could, which gave him some relief, but not much. Tears rolled down his face as it swelled and turned blue, and even though I could not see the noose, I could see the bruised purple skin where it had squeezed around his neck. All the while I screamed myself hoarse. Help. Somebody please. Jesus Christ, we need help in here. But nobody came. And all of a sudden, some unseen force seemed to sweep my feet out from under me. I dropped like a bag of bricks, but I was so startled I maintained my grip around the warden's legs. I fell and yanked him down with me, and his body suddenly jolted with a sickening crack. It took me a while to manage the courage to look up at him. His neck had been stretched far too long, and his head was bent to the side at almost a 90-degree angle. Eyes wide, round and bloated, tongue hanging from dry lips. And then whatever force had suspended him disappeared, and his body fell upon me while I screamed and screamed. I came bursting from his office to find my co-workers casually chatting and working just outside. Somehow, despite all my screaming and begging while Taft was dying, none of them had heard a thing. I took a page from Taft. I wanted out. We were dealing with something unholy here, something whose tendrils could reach any distance, and my life, who knows, maybe even my soul, was at hazard. But the agents in the sharp suits made one thing clear. If I refused to cooperate, well, I would make the perfect scapegoat for the murder of Warden Taft. I was marched into the interrogation room to find a Joseph Glass that had abandoned all pretense of humanity. His eyes had darkened to a pure black. Or perhaps he had no eyes at all, only windows into some place of outer darkness. I was shaking like a leaf as I sat in front of him, feeling more like a prisoner than he was. I'm a Mr. Glass. No reply. I shuddered, trying to focus on my little piece of paper to distract myself from the blackness of his eyes. I have some questions I'm supposed to ask you. Is that okay? Silence. I take a deep breath. How old are you, Glass? I thought it was just one of those basic questions. Conversation starters, really. I couldn't have prepared myself for his answer. I am old, child. His voice was nothing like I remembered. It was deep and low and rumbling, like there were multiple people speaking in unison, and all were equally ancient. Older than you could possibly know. Older than this nation, and older even than the empire that once bore it. I had to fight the basic animal instinct to flee. Focus on the questions, I thought. Why did you do what you did to those girls? Just so I could feel something again, he whispered. Anything. Did you not feel the slightest bit of guilt? Remorse? You ask that of me? Me who has watched empires rise and fall. He almost sounded amused. Does time feel remorse? For time has killed far more than I. But mankind is like the Hydra. All I've killed will be replaced by, essentially, identical stock and in greater numbers. And then they will die and be replaced. And so the cycle will continue forever. Did you expect me to pity them for being given the death I, myself, covet? Only the dead are given leave of the cycle. It is a blessing. And suddenly he stood from his chair as if he'd never been restrained at all. A blessing you promised me, Officer Mendez? I stared up at him in disbelief. What? How did you? But I couldn't even stammer a sentence out before he was upon me, crawling over the table with the eerie grace of a spider. These were no longer the imperceptible hints of emotions I'd come to expect. It was like a switch had been flipped. Tears streamed down his cheeks, snarling with genuine rage, hurt, betrayal. And beneath those black seas in his eyes, all the things that haunted the fathoms below were rising to the surface. You owe me a death. Make good on your word. Pay your debt. I cried out and recoiled from his every touch with disgust, but he was stronger than he looked. I couldn't worm my way out of his impossible grip. I won't. Get off of me, you sick bastard. Do it. Pay me what you owe. It was like 1,000 different voices screaming in my ear. Straining and weeping, I locked my hands around his neck and pressed my thumbs against his throat, trying to strangle him. But instead, I could just feel that grip upon my own neck, squeezing the life out of myself as my lungs burned for air. Yet I kept pressing harder and harder, as if hoping I might somehow break through whatever unholy force was protecting him. And then those terrible hands grasped my shoulders again, and I was paralyzed by a terror that could be called nothing but ancient and primal. Like the thing standing behind me was the same force that had kept my ancestors huddled terrified in their caves 100,000 years ago, and every one of those voices was crying out to me through my very blood. And it pulled me from my chair, threw me as though I were weightless. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the infirmary. Once more, none of this was captured on the security camera. In the footage, I just enter the room and have a seat with strange, almost robotic movements. And then the both us just sit there, staring at each other without speaking, without moving, without blinking. For an hour. After this, Joseph Glass entered a catatonic state, and from then on refused to converse with even me. Now that my usefulness had ended, the agents discarded me like yesterday's trash. Don't even seem to care if I tell anybody. Who would believe me? I thought I'd gotten lucky. That my nightmare was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Go sorting through any public records and you won't find a single mention of the name Joseph Glass. They've squirreled him away in that off-the-books black site and scrubbed away every other trace of him. I'd say he'd been unpersoned, if indeed he could ever be called a person at all. But they're still trying every execution method in the book. I don't know quite why. Maybe it's for research. I'm sure the US military would love to find a secret to making its men as unkillable as Glass. And besides, they're not the ones who have to deal with the consequences. On June 3, 2005, they tried a firing squad. I know this because me and my wife were out on our second honeymoon, slow dancing by the lake at night to our favorite song, when I felt a wetness against my chest. I looked down to see her eyes as gray and dull as foggy glass, and her chest shredded to Swiss cheese by rounds that made no sound. On December 23, 2012, they tried lethal injection. That was the day they found my son's car wrapped around a tree, and baffled coroners discovered that he was dead before the accident even occurred, his bloodstream polluted with pavulon and potassium chloride. It's been years since I've isolated myself from everyone I knew, hermiting away in this cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and yet the stench of death still follows me. Just a couple years ago, I found a news report mentioning my nephew. Apparently, he'd been found completely exsanguinated, his veins emptied utterly despite no signs of a struggle. God knows what kind of arcane methods of execution they're trying by now. He's not going to let me walk away from this. Not while I still owe him a debt. But I've been doing some research too. Research into those untold legions of things I witnessed staring up from that blackened sea in Glass's eyes. I've learned things men were not meant to know. Practiced rites, assembled tools, ingredients. And I think I know where they're keeping him. Even though they blindfolded me, I counted the second between every turn on our way to the black site, and I've since spent weeks watching the place, cataloging every entry point. Maybe I'm slipping into madness. Or maybe I've truly found the way to put an end to the horror. To finally give this monster the justice that Taft would have wanted for him. Joseph Glass had been right about one single thing. I have to pay what I owe. Even if it kills me. I just found my wife outside. I'm sitting here freaking out. It's 3:17 a.m. and I just found my wife outside. This is going to be a mess as I'm still shaking, but let me explain it as best I can. So a bunch of years ago we lived in another house. One night I woke up in the middle of the night because I heard noises coming from the other half of the house. I quietly opened the bedroom door and immediately saw a light on in my wife's study, which was situated next to the kitchen. The house we lived in was a few blocks away from the bad neighborhood, so my immediate thought was that someone had broken in and was going through the stuff in my wife's room, as my wife had come to bed with me several hours prior and as far as I knew, she was still in bed. I crept through the house and was ready to confront the person in the room, when I realized that it was my wife. In my still half-asleep state, I just assumed she was still in bed. Turns out she had woken up, couldn't get back to sleep, and so went to her room to browse Facebook or whatever for a while. I had almost confronted my own wife thinking she was a burglar. Now in our current house we have a screen door and a wooden door. The wooden door has a deadbolt on it, and you have to make sure that you take the house keys with you because if you close the wooden door, you're not getting back in unless you grab the hidden spare key or knock on the door/window to be let back in. So it's about an hour ago, I'm woken up by the front door rattling. I immediately grab my phone and pull up the security camera located right by the front door. To my surprise, I see my wife standing there, kinda shivering. It's definitely her because we've been married over a decade and I know what my own wife looks like. She's dressed in the same clothing she wore today, a red top and black pants. 100% her. I don't know what she's doing outside, but she is. Confused, I roll over and there's my wife fast asleep. Remembering the incident in our last place, I use my phone screen to shine a light on her and confirm that it's definitely her and she's definitely in the bed. At this point I'm really confused. I get up and make my way through the house to the front door. As I walk into the lounge room, our cat looks up at me, half asleep. Normally she's super curious about stuff going on outside, and I would have thought that hearing the screen door rattling would have caused her to be at the door trying to see what's going on, but it's as if she hasn't heard a thing. I stand by the door and call out, "Who is it?" "It's me, hurry up and let me back in, I'm freezing." I went outside because I heard something but forgot to take the keys in my bag with me. That absolutely sounds like my wife. Accent, intonation, knowledge about where her set of keys are, everything. But I'm not convinced because I've just seen her sleeping in the bed with my own eyes. "Hold on a second," I tell her. Now I'm heading back through the house and into the bedroom. I wake up my wife and say, "This is really fucking weird, you have to see this." I open the camera app and show her the front door. She's still at the door looking around, wondering what I'm doing because all I need to do to let her back in is turn the handle on the deadbolt and open the door. My wife says, "What the fuck? When was that recorded?" I tell her, "It's not. This is live. You're standing outside by the front door. I just went down there and asked who it was, and your voice told me it was you and that I should let you back in because you're freezing and you left your keys in your bag." My wife gets up and peers through the bedroom window, as you can just see the front door alcove from there. She gasps and pulls the curtains shut. She turns around and I'll never forget the look on her face as long as I live. She's terrified. "That's me," she says. At this point I'm freaked the fuck out. I'm wide awake. I'm speaking to my wife and I'm physically touching her while trying to peer out the window with her, but there she is, standing outside in the very outfit she wore today. Same hair, same glasses, same everything. We walk into the lounge room and I grab the big torch I have. It's a big sturdy metal super bright light, great for blinding people and hitting them if they get too close. We stand by the door again. "What's your name?" I ask. She tells me her full name including her middle name. It's correct. "What's your birth date?" She tells me. It's also correct. "What did we have for dinner tonight?" She tells me this too and tells me that I cooked it. This is right too. I can hear my real wife standing next to me trying to control her breathing as she's scared out of her wits. I nudge her and whisper, "Ask her something only you would know." After a moment to steady herself and think of something, she speaks. "When we last stayed with my parents, what change had Dad made to my old room?" There was a pause. "Who is that?" the person outside said. "Why aren't you letting me in?" "You know it's me. You're starting to freak me out here. Who is that inside with you? Is that a recording of me? What's going on here?" I said, "Answer the question. What change had been made to your room when we last visited?" Another pause, then finally, there was a second bed added as Max and Damien, my brother-in-law's two kids, sleep in there while visiting Mom and Dad. There's an audible gasp from my wife next to me. Now we're both freaked out. I grab her hand and lead her back into the bedroom and turn the lights on. We're still awake watching the cameras. The other person walked towards the backyard, presumably to grab the spare key, but that was about 40 minutes ago and I haven't seen them since. I'm too shit scared to go to bed because I'm scared that this person who knew everything about my wife will find the spare key and enter. I don't know who the fuck they really are or what they want, but I'm not sleeping. My husband started teasing me after I suffered a serious head injury. I literally can't go on like this. Back before my head injury, my husband and I had this cheesy ritual. If I ever got held up late at the office and needed to catch the last train home, he'd wait for me at the station and accidentally brush against me as I disembarked at the platform. He'd put on a bashful voice, acting like we were meeting for the first time, and say, "I'm sorry I bumped into you, ma'am. It's just you've the most distracting green eyes. Could I maybe walk you home?" And every damn time, it made me melt like butter in a hot pan. Yes, I know I'm lame. But one night, the platform was empty when those automatic doors hissed shut behind me. My stomach lurched. Exiting the station, a concrete set of stairs spat you out into a long, filthy, poorly lit underground tunnel, and this was the real reason for Darren and I's tradition, because neither of us liked the idea of me walking home by myself. As my calls went unanswered, I stood there, my leg bouncing up and down. Lampposts flicked on beyond the iron fence surrounding the station and the sky grew darker until, finally, I saw no choice other than to set off as quickly as I could. Inside the underpass, sputtering halogen bulbs were spaced out every 10 meters or so. I half-walked, half-jogged from one flickering pool of light to the next, inhaling through my mouth to avoid the combined stink of 1,000 relieved bladders. Halfway along, a rapid skitter of footsteps rushed up behind me. I spun around. My chest collided with something solid, then two hands shot out and grabbed me by the wrists. In the dim light, I could make out dark hair and a set of deep blue eyes. I heaved a giant sigh of relief. "Darren." "Darling," the man answered. Altogether, the hairs along my arms and neck stood on end. It wasn't my husband. My brain went into full-blown panic mode, which means the rest of the encounter is still a giant blur, but I know I lashed out with punches and kicks. My fingernails raked the man's left eye and gouged his nose. He kept yelling something, but it was impossible to hear beneath my screams bouncing off the walls. At one point I bit down on his hand hard, and his skin's rough texture is the part clearest in my mind. After that, there are images of me lying in a gathering pool of blood while the man apologizes, and if I really squint my memory, there's confused glimpses of sharp teeth intermixed with a haze of darkness. From there, everything jump cuts to a ring of empty faces towering over me. Those faces were like the expressionless mannequins you see in shop windows. With my heart in my throat, I thrashed around in a soft bed, screaming until the mannequins rushed to restrain me. Then I rode off into a wave of blackness. Next time the world slid into focus, a single mannequin was beside my bed, dressed in a nurse's uniform. A soft, disembodied voice came floating along, promising everything would be okay. From somewhere close by, the continuous beep 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 of a heart monitor gathered speed, and gradually I realized I was in a hospital. I swallowed a lump and asked the nurse what happened to her face. The voice asked what I meant. I said the nurse's skull looked as if when God designed her he'd loaded up Photoshop and gone crazy with the smudge tool. It was a smooth mound of pink flesh. The faceless nurse explained I'd suffered a serious head injury, and showered me with kindness and support while a series of torches got shown in my eyes and my vitals got checked a dozen or so times. The voice kept telling me not to move around too much, otherwise the stitches across the top of my head might have popped loose. Another figure with an empty skull, this one dressed in a doctor's coat, came and stood at the foot of my bed, and that's when I first heard the term prosopagnosia, also known as face blindness. The condition can result from a traumatic brain injury. What followed was a flurry of activity. Darren, who I only recognized by his haircut and voice, was allowed to sit with me. I squeezed his hand throughout the onslaught of tears and endless visits from neurologists. On his way to the station the night of the attack, Darren had seen a newly licensed teen driver slam on their brakes way too late to stop at a red light. An old lady got sent careening into the air, and Darren called for an ambulance while he applied pressure to the poor woman's chest to keep her from bleeding out. That was the reason he missed my calls. A woman named Tracy and her German shepherd, Buster, were drawn to the tunnel by my screams. Tracy sicked Buster on my attacker, who bolted off in the direction of the station, covered in my blood. Both Tracy and Buster visited me at the hospital, and we posed for a photo which made the front page of the local newspaper. The story about a hero dog included a blurb about my condition, even though we specifically asked the reporter not to include it. Two police officers, who I could only distinguish by their difference in height, questioned me about my attacker. Judging by their irritated voices, they'd hoped to learn more than his hair looked sorta like Darren's. Although it took days of interrogation, I convinced Darren to reveal what else authorities knew about the man. It turned out, after Buster chased him to the platform, the bastard took off running along the curved track. Tracy called the police, who went after him, flashlights in hand, but only discovered a discarded backpack a quarter-mile north. So far as anybody could tell, my attacker dropped it climbing a fence to escape into the loading bay of a warehouse. Inside the pack they found creep shots of me, along with journal entries and love letters filled with strange details about our supposed relationship. The officer said he might have been stalking me for as long as half a year, living out a fantasy in which we were husband and wife. Their promises they'd have him in custody soon rang a little hollow. In the weeks I spent confined to the ward, I got a crash course in how difficult life with prosopagnosia really is. Dressed in their identical hospital gowns, my fellow patients were impossible to tell apart unless they had a unique feature, like green nail polish, and I suffered a mild panic attack every time somebody in my inner circle changed their hairstyle or bought a new outfit. After a whirlwind of scans and tests, the doctor suggested I should consult a specialist, although I could tell they hadn't much faith I would ever recover. Good thing I never wanted to be a police sketch artist, because some of the creep shots were taken from the back garden. Darren and I moved to a new house on the opposite side of town. Anytime I caught a glimpse of my reflection, my pulse launched into the stratosphere, so I insisted we not keep any mirrors. Early one morning, a fortnight later, a stranger with a profile matching my attacker's knocked on the front door. I'd already grabbed a vase that sat on a nearby side table when, in a silly voice, Darren said he was sorry to bother me, but that I had the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen and presented me with a bouquet of roses. He was teasing me again, playing make-believe like old times. Now on the verge of a heart attack, I told him I needed to sit. He apologized 1,000 times. I told him it was okay, but that I'd prefer we never did that silly roleplay game ever again. He of course agreed. In the weeks that followed, my confidence in my ability to read people swelled. Everybody had a tell, be it a tendency to wear noisy jewelry or a compulsive habit of scratching their ear. In time, I adapted to this new way of seeing, or not seeing, the world. Until tonight. There we were, watching Rick and Morty in the bedroom. I'd never liked cartoons before, but since the Diagnosis live-action stuff had become tricky to follow, so I gravitated towards anything with bright colors and distinct patterns. Afterwards, as I lay facing the wall and scrolling through Reddit, Darren pulled on his navy robe and shuffled off downstairs to use the bathroom. I was still reading the same post when footsteps came marching along the hall. Straight away my skin prickled. What? Was it the speed? Or maybe the rhythm? As the door creaked open, I glanced over at Darren, still in his robe. By the time he crossed the room and slid in next to me, my spine was slicked with sweat. I could still smell the woody scent of his cologne, so what set off the alarm bells in my mind? As an arm reached out and coiled around my stomach, my heart thrashed against my chest. At the corner of my eye, a blank face stared straight at me, silent and unmoving. The way that rough hand probed my stomach and the taste of those foul breaths, it all evoked memories of the tunnel. I rolled toward the wall, suddenly trapped beneath the hot cavern of bedclothes, and that brings us to now. I can't tell if I'm being paranoid or if the figure beside me is my stalker posing as my husband. If it is my stalker, he must have learned about my condition from the article and is living out his fantasy. I'm afraid what might happen if I run or call the police. I'm not even letting myself think about what happened to Darren. But it could also be I'm freaking out over nothing like before. There's no way to be sure without making it obvious I'm suspicious. So I'm just gonna lie here pretending to browse Reddit until whoever's beside me's breaths fall into a slow, rhythmic pattern. Then I'll slip away as quietly as I can. So if you don't hear from me again, you'll know my instincts were correct. Wish me luck. I'm the sole survivor of a roller coaster that couldn't be stopped for 12 hours last year. I learned a lesson I will never forget. Trust your gut. I had the day off from work. I wanted to do something fun, but everyone I knew was busy. Makes sense. I mean, it was a Tuesday. I decided I'd just go to the amusement park by myself. I've done it before and had a great time. I'm a bit of a thrill seeker. Well, not too much anymore. Going 5 miles over the speed limit is about all the excitement I want out of life anymore. I got to the park at around 2 p.m. It was slow. Even for a Tuesday. It gave me a sense of excitement because I knew I'd be able to ride a lot of rides without having to be there all day. At the same time, it gave me a weird, uncanny feeling. All this space and not enough people to fill it up. I ignored the feeling and moved on. I don't know about you, but whenever I go to an amusement park, I like to work my way up to the really crazy rides. I'll start small and finish off the day with my favorite. My favorite just happened to be called the Grim Reaper. It feels a little too on the nose, doesn't it? It was 7:30 p.m., and the park closed at 8 p.m. And I knew it was time to get in line for my final ride. I also made a new friend while there. We met standing in line at one of my first rides of the day. We decided after chatting the whole time in line that we'd hang out for the rest of the day. His name was Charlie. We agreed on every ride that day, except for the last. He wanted to end the night on the Mindbinder, but after some convincing, the Mindbinder's line was way shorter while passing by. We decided to do the Grim Reaper last. We got in line for the Grim Reaper and there was hardly anyone in line. It made sense given that it was almost closing time. Do you think they will let us ride multiple times if the line stays down? Charlie said with his hands clasped excitedly in front of him. I just smiled at him and chuckled. Normally I would have been excited too, but something in my gut felt so off. For some reason, I didn't want to go on one of my favorite rides. Maybe it was the 5 corn dogs I ate a couple hours earlier, I figured. I'm a very rational person. I wasn't the kind of person to let anxiety or worry rule over me. I always thought life was just what you made of it. When we got in line, there were about 60 people, give or take. The people in front of us did their ride, and 30 of us were left in line. People started looking at the time and saying they were tired and just getting out of line. By the time it was our turn, only 19 people were in line. I knew the ride well enough to remember that it held 20 people, so if no one else got in line, they really might let us go multiple times. I really didn't want that though. Honestly, I felt even more compelled to get out of line after all those others did too. And I didn't want to seem lame to my new friend if I wanted to get off the coaster after one ride. The time came for us to get on the ride. My heart was pounding faster than it ever had. I wondered if I was all worked up because I watched Final Destination 3 with a friend a couple weeks back. But I wasn't having visions of the terrible fate we would all face. I was just feeling off. I did everything in my power to get it to all make sense and to not worry, but nothing worked. I seriously considered just telling Charlie I didn't feel great after the last ride, but I finally found someone with my taste in roller coasters. I didn't want to let him down. We were towards the back of the line, so we didn't have much say in where we sat. We ended up in the third car from the front. I was just happy we weren't in the front car. As you get on the Grim Reaper, it plays a cheesy little jingle. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, the Grim Reaper will find you dead or alive. With music in the background that always sounded so dumb in the past. I couldn't believe it was getting to me. Charlie even hummed along to it while grabbing my arm with happiness. We got in our seats, and an employee came by and pulled down the metal bar restraint to secure us in our seats. It was the kind that strapped you individually over your shoulder. I'm on the chubbier side, but I can always fit into coaster seats. I've never been told I couldn't go on a ride. I'm just sometimes a little snug. It's actually kind of nice because I feel very secure. As we got strapped in, I felt the plastic-coated metal hit my shoulders and chest. It should have given me a sense of comfort and safety, but I just felt trapped. The employee walked back to the station that has the infamous big button that starts the ride. He flashed all a thumbs up and yelled, "Ready for the Reaper?" Everyone raised their hands and let out an excited scream. Except for me. I let out a large sigh, counting down the seconds. Trying to imagine Charlie and I once we were off the ride and how happy we would be. The employee hit the button and we were. The coaster shot out of the loading station like we were a bullet being shot out of a gun. After that, it started on a relatively slow ascent up a point to a drop-off of 60 degrees, a couple of twists and turns, a big loop, and some more twists and turns. About halfway through the ride, I was enjoying myself. I was thinking about how the hard part was done and I was safe. Just a little anxiety was all. We were rounding out our last bend when a sense of relief came over me. I could see the end of the ride. I was almost done. But the ride didn't start to slow down. Normally, the coaster starts to slowly come to a full stop several hundred feet from the end, but it was still going. As we passed by the loading area, I saw the operators look confused as we raced by. I noticed no one else was waiting in line. Someone screamed, "One more time." And everyone on board gave an excited response. Everyone except for me. Charlie looked over at me and grabbed my wrist. Yes, I knew they would let us keep going. This is awesome. He let out an excited yelp as we reached the climb to the drop. He was beaming with joy the whole rest of the lap. We passed by the loading area once again, but this time the coaster operator had a couple other people standing with him. The operator who strapped us looked red and worried. As we were whipped by the employees for our third ride of the day, the other riders were divided. Some were still excited, screaming, "Let's go! One more time!" Or "Best day ever!" Yeah. Some people started to sound scared. Not everyone noticed the employees looking frazzled. I can promise you one thing. I noticed. We started going up the incline again. This was the slowest part of the ride at around 10 miles per hour and slowing down a little as it reached its peak. This gave us opportunities to take a breath or try to talk. Although it was only for a total of about 20 seconds. Are we stuck? I said nervously to Charlie. I'm sure we are fine. There is just a malfunction with the electrical system not activating the brakes or something. There is always a manual. Shut off. He was cut off and we went down the steep hill. We passed by yet again, this time with more people looking worried and someone standing close to where the coaster would go by. He tried to yell at us as we went by, but we couldn't really understand him. Maybe something about them working on getting us off. This time as we zoomed by, everyone was scared and starting to panic. I guess it didn't sink in for some people what was happening until right now. We went around a fifth time and everything remained the same. On the sixth time we were at the peak and saw a fire truck coming into the parking lot. From the top of the incline we had a perfect view of the parking lot, along with the side of a highway a little further out. It took 2 more loops around the track by the time the fire department got to us. Not just them but police officers and ambulances. It started to scare me. Why did they get ambulances? Is it just protocol or is there more to this? Someone came in a few minutes later with a big white board that they used to write messages to us. The ride was too loud when passing by them to hear anything, so this was their only way to talk to us. It must have been the 12th or 13th time around when the whiteboard read, "Trying to free you at peak." I knew they couldn't write a novel for us because you can only read so much while going by so fast, but come on, people, what is that supposed to mean? I think they just wanted to tell us they were working on a way to get us down, but that didn't matter. We had been on this ride for nearly 30 minutes and we felt sick and our bodies hurt like crazy. A couple loops after that, we saw a fire truck trying to get underneath where the top of the ascent was. Luckily, there was a large space where the truck could pull right beside it. Unfortunately, at its peak, it's about 200 feet in the air. It also didn't have any emergency exits at the top, like most coasters do. You'd think that would be a requirement, but what do I know? We saw the fire truck start to expand the ladder that comes out the top, but it wasn't even close. We waited for the firefighters to try and figure out a solution to save us, as the audience below us was watching us like we were some kind of show. It was close to 45 minutes when the first death occurred, then one more soon after. There was a skinnier guy in a car behind me. I heard him talking about trying to slip out of the seat restraint, which secured him to his seat. The other guy he was with told him it was a bad idea. So did I. The next time we went up the ascent, he began violently wiggling and thrashing back and forth, to the point where people thought he was going to throw off the ride. He managed to wiggle about halfway out, right at the top. But well, it didn't end very well. His leg got caught on a part of the track and yanked the rest of his body out of the bar restraint. It sent his body crashing down towards the earth. However, I think he was dead soon after he was ripped out of his seat. I didn't see too much of it, but the guy who was beside him let out an insane screech. Hearing that kind of agony as you are feeling the harsh effects of gravity hitting on your chest while going down a steep hill was truly mortifying. The screech out of nowhere stopped and more people screamed. The man beside him had a heart attack. I could hear the symphony of moans and crying coming from the crowd watching us. I couldn't hear them before because of how loud the ride was, but they were terrified of what they saw. Police tried to escort them out of the park, but it didn't stop people from parking on the side of the road to watch and record on their phones. It made me feel disgusted. At around an hour on the ride, everyone stopped screaming or trying to talk to each other. It seemed like everyone accepted their fate. My nails were deeply embedded into Charlie's wrist. I couldn't scream anymore due to my throat feeling raw from the yelling. Even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't due to my voice giving out. I saw that I drew a little blood on Charlie, but he was too out of it to notice. He, along with a few other people, were incredibly sick. He threw up probably 5 times by this point and looked cross-eyed. Around that time, the electricity in the whole park shut down. All the lights, everything. I think they were hoping a hard reboot of the whole park would stop the ride. The coaster didn't just rely on gravity but also on a lot of help from motors and other electronic elements. It all turned off when we were on the straightaway. Of course, it still didn't stop. I could hear someone yelling with frustration, not understanding how it could still be moving if it didn't have an electrical source. After 2 hours, they let some family members come into the loading area, which was a terrible idea. We were doing our best to keep cool and stay calm. Our families washing us, zooming by them every 2 minutes and absolutely screaming at us, made it so much worse. My mom was my first family member to show up. Don't get me wrong. I love my mom, but she's very stubborn and wanted something done even though they had already tried everything. Of course, it was just because she wanted me safe, but it was stressing me out. The firefighters put down a safety net underneath the ascent. It was still quite a jump if we could even get out successfully to land on it, and we might be okay, but we were all a little scarred from what happened before. It seemed like they put it out just in case someone tried to get out again. It didn't seem like it was the plan to have us all just jump out of that moving death machine. They weren't desperate enough at that point. We saw a large group of people passionately arguing and yelling at each other. From what I could tell, it was made up of family members, firefighters, and some employees of the park. I'm sure with lots of varying opinions. The ride was on hour 3. When the coaster entered the loading area once again, I saw a woman run over to the control panel. A couple people ran over to her and told her to stop and not press the button. She was screaming her head off and wailing. It had been hard to understand people in the past while going by them, but this was as clear as day. As we passed by, I could tell she was starting to break free from the grip of people holding her back. I wasn't too worried. Whatever button she was wanting to press, I'm sure it wouldn't work since none of the other ones worked so far. We were about 5 seconds away from going down the descent when we heard a click come from all our seats. The woman hit the button that unlocked all our overhead seat belts. Of course, the seatbelt button worked, but not the button to stop the ride. A few people reacted fast enough to either jump out or snap it back over themselves before the ride went down. Others weren't so lucky. 3 people managed to jump out but didn't survive the fall. Despite there now being a giant net to catch anyone who was dumb enough to try and get out that high, one person hit a support beam on the way down, and the other 2 landed wrong when they hit the net. Their bodies folded in an unnatural manner. As they hit, all 3 died instantly. I would say around half of us that were left managed to get the seatbelt secured before going down the hill. Everyone else had to hold on for dear life. And unfortunately, I was one of them. I felt my stomach start to drop as I reached up to grab the only thing that would keep me from becoming a part of the pavement below. The restraint wasn't completely useless at this point. I just had a good 12 inches in between my chest and the restraint. As I dug my fingers into the plastic, I hoped I would be fine. Then the ride dropped. I felt my butt lift off the seat I had become so familiar with. I tried to wrap my ankles around the floor of the coaster to keep the rest of my body from flying out. Charlie luckily got the restraint down, so he was trying to get his leg over mine and hold me down with his arm. After the longest 5 seconds of my life, I managed to pull it back down over my chest. I wasn't sure who else got theirs down, but I assumed, from how scared a few of them sounded, it wasn't good. All I could think about and look at was the big loop coming up. As we got closer, I could hear swearing from multiple passengers, including someone in front of me. She was violently pulling at the restraint, but it just wasn't budging. I was hoping and praying that the centrifugal force would keep her in her seat. As we went around the big loop, I closed my eyes. I knew I didn't want to see what was about to happen. I heard multiple people screaming and making horrendous cracking sounds. I don't have an exact number, but I would say only 7 people were left. I could see the 2 people in the very front row and Charlie beside me. I recall only hearing 3 other voices behind me at this point. At hour 5, 3 more people died while on the ride. 2 of them from a heart attack or something. The 3rd person, well, he watched the person beside him suddenly die while going around one of the bends. He yelled out in anger and well, I'd actually rather not go into detail. But he died soon after. I saw the whole thing. They were the 2 people left in front of me and Charlie. At hour 6, we saw a group of people bringing in what looked like another large net, except that it was in the loading area. The next time we looped around, they wrote something new on the big whiteboard. "We are going to try and stop it manually." I had no clue what this meant, but by the look of the net, I was terrified. The next pass, there were people on both sides of the loading area. On one side, the net was wrapped around a large pole that had been somehow fastened into the concrete slab. I saw a large, similar pole on the other side, but the net wasn't yet attached. As we zoomed by, I could hear people trying to rush and hurry behind us. We went around one of the turns and I cranked my neck, looking to see what plan they had in mind. They were frantically trying to tie the other side of the net to the support beam that was freshly drilled into the ground. I couldn't believe how stupid these people were. How on earth did they think this was a good idea? Was this a last-ditch attempt? I was yelling at them and telling them to stop, but of course they couldn't hear me. Even if they could, they wouldn't listen. They were desperate to get at least someone out of this alive. Or maybe the owner of the park wanted all of us to die so that no one could publicly talk about the horrific things we went through. As we went past the last bend, the hundreds of people watching the spectacle cheered, clapped, and celebrated. Somehow, not seeing any of the flaws with this terrible plan. We were on the straightaway and my heart started to pound again. The few seconds before we hit the net felt like slow motion. I swore I could see everyone's face. They looked happy. I couldn't believe it. It made me upset because I knew they were all about to be very disappointed. Finally, we hit the net. Of course, it was no match for a giant metal contraption hitting it. The metal pole was ripped out of the concrete slab and smashed down right in between our car and the one behind us. As we headed for the incline, we tried to get the net that attached itself to us off of the coaster. Luckily, we were able to get it off of us, but no luck with the metal beam that was now awkwardly lodged in the coaster. As we started going down, the whole ride started to shake violently. It felt like we were going to fly off the track. We made it to the first turn. I heard a loud snap and 2 screams. The 7 coaster cars behind ours broke off, and the metal beam found its way underneath. As we turned, I watched in disbelief as the cars behind us all went flying off the tracks. At that point in the ride, it was about 50 feet off the ground. Still enough to kill them. I wasn't fast enough to close my eyes and saw the whole thing. It went off the track like it had wings and suddenly plummeted down into the earth. The screaming immediately stopped when the ride landed upside down. My imagination filled in the blanks and shuddered at the thought of the carnage below me. And then, there were 2 We were hoping that somehow the ride would stop or slow down because we lost the back 7 cars. I was not sure what the logic was, but we were desperate at this point. After another hour, it was not showing any signs of slowing down. Once we made it to hour 8, we expected our fate. I was hoping that this would all be over soon and we could just be done. I don't think either one of us thought we'd get off. We just hoped at this point that our deaths would be quick. Over the next couple hours, we noticed a piece of metal on the car ahead of us start to wobble and loosen. I'm not sure if it was just the wear and tear of the ride going for so long or the whole net fiasco. It kept looking like it was about to come loose and we duck out of the way. We were imagining the worst possible outcome, thinking it would fly off and decapitate one of us. Eventually it did come off. But it wasn't a dramatic moment like we thought it would be. It was so much worse. Instead of coming all the way off, it only partially came off and started grinding loudly against the track. We heard an audible cringing sound from everyone watching below. The sound was horrendous. The thin strip of metal started to find its way underneath the car. Charlie was worried it would dislodge the coaster from its tracks like we saw just hours before. He told me he was going to try and grab it. I begged him not to. After a few laps of me telling him to just leave it, he made up his mind and contorted his body to try and grab the sharp metal. I couldn't see his hand as he reached down for it, but I could see his face. Somehow that made it worse. His expression quickly changed from focused to shocked in a matter of seconds. His face was blank. I heard screaming but had no clue what was going on. He lifted up his arm and I don't think I will ever be able to get the image of what used to be his arm out of my head. When he gripped the metal, it slipped and went deep into his forearm. I tried to grab his shoulder to calm him down, but to my shock he was calm. He was more silent at that moment than he had been the whole day. He wouldn't even look at me. He was almost mesmerized by the sight of his bloodied, disfigured arm. I felt lightheaded and had a ringing in my ears. Watching the blood start to make its way down his entire body, then to me in the floor of the coaster. It was making me feel sick watching the blood move around the car as we went around the twists and turns of the ride. Within minutes, Charlie looked like a ghost. I did my best to try and wrap his arm up with shreds of my shirt, but it was completely pointless. I don't think an old t-shirt can help when you see the bone. I tried to talk to him. I tried to make him feel as comfortable as I could, but it was no use. He was fading in and out of consciousness. We began going up the ascent and he finally looked over at me. I couldn't begin to explain all that I saw in his eyes. Could see the pain and sadness but also the relief. He knew he was going to die, but I don't think he cared. He gave me a weak nod of the head and looked ahead when we went down the hill. I tried to keep a close eye on him this lap, but it was honestly hard to look at him. I heard him take a deep breath right before the loop. When we finished the loop, I looked over at him and, well, he was gone. I was now left alone in the death trap. I never imagined it could have gotten any worse. But having a dead body sitting next to you on a roller coaster is not something I would recommend. I was sitting in shock next to my dead friend for a couple hours. I was frozen in fear, not wanting to even think of a way out. After gaining some courage, I contemplated my next move. I came back into reality and realized the coaster was going just slightly slower. It wasn't significant, but if the loops were taking just slightly longer than before, that damn piece of metal that killed Charlie must have made its way underneath and not derailed it but slowed it down. I ended up taking off my shoes and Charlie's shoes. I had a plan that was probably dumb, but if I died, at least it would be in my hands. As I went by the loading area, the coaster started to slow down just before the ascent. I threw all 4 shoes right in front of the ride. A part of a shoe caught the truck in just the right spot. The ride was still. I could feel the coaster almost pulsing, trying to move with all its might. I was sore. My shoulders were badly buried by the shoulder restraints, repeatedly hitting me over and over again. My whole lower half aching from sitting in a hard seat for hours on hours. I took a deep breath and squeezed in my gut like I never had before. I let out a horrific yell as I forced my body out of the restraint that had been holding me down for the last 12 hours. About 360 times around the track. My heart was racing as I felt the coaster start to win the battle to move again. I managed to squeeze out just seconds before it took off. I was freed and jumped. Luckily, I just barely hit the net below. I also managed to hit the net, so I didn't hurt myself too badly. Nothing is worse than what that ride already did to me. I laid on the net, looking up into the sky. In disbelief. I was still. I wasn't moving. It was almost making me feel motion sick not moving around. Like when you are reading a book in the car and you look up after an hour. Everything was blurry. I could barely hear the faint sound of people trying to get to me. But it was mostly just my ears ringing and my heart beating. After just a few minutes, I was down. They immediately rushed me to the ER, where I stayed for 3 weeks. I sustained a broken rib, a broken collarbone, severe bruising, and a concussion, just to name a few. Not to mention the mental trauma. I'm writing this as I'm feeling ready to finally tell my story. This is the first time I'm digging back into my memories and recollecting the whole experience. I started to work through all this with a therapist, and it's made me realize I need to get it all out of my system. Don't bother trying to find anything about this story. The owners of the park have done a suspiciously good job hiding it. That's another reason I want to get my story out there. They have completely scrubbed the internet of it somehow. Although talking with a professional has helped, there are still some sounds and images that I can just never completely get out of my head. If you take one thing from my story, it's that you should trust yourself. Even if you don't believe in a higher power or gut instincts, if you have a feeling, trust it, please.